It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Our book today is Us Versus Them, The Failure of Globalism by Ian Bremmer. This is from chapter 1, titled Winners and Losers. It's time for a local revolution, the candidate told the roaring crowd. Countries are no longer nations, but markets. Borders are erased. Everyone can come to our country, and this has cut our salaries and our social protections. This dilutes our cultural identity. Marine Le Pen's 4 sentences capture every important element of the anxiety rising across the Western world. The borders are open and the foreigners are coming. They'll steal your job. They will cost you your pension and your health care by bankrupting your system. They will pollute your culture. Some of them are killers. Le Pen fell short in her bid to become France's president in 2017, but her message remains compelling for the 21st century politics of us versus them. But this is not a story about Marine Le Pen or Donald J. Trump or any of the other populist powerhouses who have emerged in Europe and the United States in recent years. Spin the camera toward the furious crowd. There's the real story. It's not the messenger that drives this movement. It's the fears, often, if not always, justified, of ordinary people. Fears of lost jobs, surging waves of strangers, vanishing national identities, and the incomprehensible public violence associated with terrorism. It's the growing doubt among citizens that government can protect them, provide them with opportunities for a better life, and help them remain the masters of their fate. As of December 2015, just 6% of people in the United States, 4% in Germany, 4% in Britain, and 3% in France believe the world is getting better. The pessimistic majority suspects that those with power, money, and influence care more about their cosmopolitan world than they do about their fellow citizens. Many citizens of these countries now believe that globalization works for the favored few, but not for them. And they have a point. Globalization, the cross-border flow of ideas, information, money, people, goods, and services, has resulted in an interconnected world where national leaders have increasingly limited ability to protect the lives and livelihoods of their citizens. In the digital age, borders no longer mean what citizens think they mean. In some ways, they barely exist. Globalism, the belief that the interdependence that created globalization is a good thing, is indeed the ideology of the elite. Political leaders of the wealthy West have been globalism's biggest advocates, building a system that has propelled ideas, information, people, money, goods, and services across borders at a speed and on a scale without precedent in human history. Sure, more than 1 billion people have risen from poverty in recent decades, and economies and markets have come a long way from the financial crisis. But along with new opportunities come serious vulnerabilities, and the refusal of the global elite to acknowledge the downsides of the new interdependence confirms the suspicions of those losing their sense of security and standard of living that elites in New York and Paris have more in common with elites in Rome and San Francisco than with their discarded countrymen in Tulsa, Turin, Tuscaloosa, and Toulon. The globalists gutted the American working class and created a middle class in Asia, former White House strategist Steve Bannon told The Hollywood Reporter a few days after Donald Trump's 2016 election victory. The issue is now about Americans looking not to get effed over, end of quote. In the United States, the jobs that once lifted generations of Americans into the middle class and kept them there for life are vanishing. Crime and drug addiction are rising. While 87% of Chinese and 74% of Indians told pollsters in 2017 that they believe their country is moving in the right direction, only 43% of Americans said the same thing. Yeah. In Europe, the European Commission and the unelected bureaucrats who enforce its rules have legislated for its 28 member nations without understanding their very needs. In recent years, they've failed to halt a debt crisis that has forced many Europeans to accept lower wages, higher prices, later retirement, less generous pensions.
Your team was able to uncover an incredible amount of information related to Russia's attack on our elections and to obstruction of justice. And there's still more that we have to learn. Despite facing unfair attacks by the president, and even here today, your work has been substantive and fair. The work has laid the critical foundation for our investigation, and for that, I thank you. I thank you. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you. Director Mueller, I'm disappointed that some have questioned your motives throughout this process, and I want to take a moment to remind the American people of who you are and your exemplary service to our country. You are a Marine. You served in Vietnam and earned a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, correct?
Correct.
Which president appointed you to become the United States Attorney for Massachusetts?
Which senator?
Which president?
Oh, which president? I think that was President Bush.
According to my notes, it was President Ronald Reagan had the honor to do so. Under whose
My mistake.
Under whose administration did you serve as the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the DOJ's Criminal Division?
Under which president?
Yep.
That would be George Bush 1.
That is correct, President George H.W. Bush. After that, you took a job at a prestigious law firm, and after only a couple years, you did something extraordinary. You left that lucrative position to re-enter public service, prosecuting homicides here in Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
Correct.
When you were named director of the FBI, which president first appointed you?
Bush.
And the Senate confirmed you with a vote of 98-0, correct?
Surprising.
And you were sworn in as director just 1 week before the September 11th attacks.
True.
You helped to protect this nation against another attack. You did such an outstanding job that when your 10-year term expired, the Senate unanimously voted to extend your term for another 2 years, correct?
True.
When you were...
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Good morning, everybody.
I'm Jefferson Smith. It is the day of Robert Mueller's testimony. We will be listening to that testimony live. I'm Jefferson Smith, sitting in for the Thom Hartmann Program while Tom is away. While other radio stations are covering top 40 songs, various claptrap, while YouTube is covering cats and people kicking off bottle caps, we're covering democracy. We're covering obstruction of justice. We're covering the question of whether accountability for the President of the United States can still exist in our nation. If you have key comments, you can tag me on Twitter at Jefferson D. Smith. You can also tweet at Thom Hartmann. You can also communicate with the studio. We'll try to get to some of those comments. Most of the comments we're going to be getting will be from members of Congress and from Robert Mueller himself. Welcome to Mystery Politics Theater 3000, the Robert Mueller Testimony Edition, as truncated as it might be. I'm Jefferson Smith, honored to be with you, and let's get back to the testimony of Robert Mueller and the questioning by the committee right now.
There were circumstances where you could have filed charges against other people, mentioned the report, but you declined. Not every prosecutor does that, certainly in a one-on-a witch hunt. The attacks made against you and your team intensified because your report is damning. And I believe you did uncover substantial evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors. Let me also say something else that you are right about. The only remedy for this situation is for Congress to take action. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Good morning, Director Mueller. Madeleine Dean.
Gotcha, sorry.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about public confusion connected with Attorney General Barr's release of your report. I will be quoting your March 27th letter. Sir, in that letter, and at several other times, did you convey to the Attorney General that the, quote, introductions and executive summaries of our 2-volume report accurately summarize this office's work and conclusions, end quote?
And I have to say that the letter itself speaks for itself.
And those were your words in that letter. Continuing with your letter, you wrote to the Attorney General that, quote, the summary letter that the department sent to Congress and released to the public late in the afternoon of March 24th did not fully capture the context, nature, and substance of this office's work and conclusions, end quote. Is that correct?
Again, I rely on the letter itself for its terms.
Thank you. What was it about the report's context, nature, substance that the Attorney General's letter did not capture?
I think we captured that in the March 27th responsive letter.
And this is from the 27th letter. What were some of the specifics that you thought?
I direct you to the letter itself.
Okay. You finished that letter by saying there is now public confusion about critical aspects as a result of our investigation. Could you tell us specifically some of the public confusion you identified?
Not generally. Again, I go back to the letter, and the letter speaks for itself.
And could Attorney General Barr have avoided public confusion if he had released your summaries and executive introduction and summaries?
And I don't feel comfortable speculating on that.
Shifting to May 30th, the Attorney General in an interview with CBS News said that you could have reached, quote, you could have reached a decision as to whether it was criminal activity, end quote, on the part of the president. Did the Attorney General or his staff ever tell you that he thought you should make a decision on whether the president engaged in criminal activity?
I'm not going to speak to what the Attorney General was thinking or saying.
If the Attorney General had directed you or ordered you to make a decision on whether the president engaged in criminal activity, would you have so done?
I can't answer that question in the vacuum.
Director Mueller, again, I thank you for being here. I agree with your March 27th letter. There was public confusion, and the president took full advantage of that confusion by falsely claiming your report found no obstruction. Let us be clear, your report did not exonerate the president. Instead, it provided substantial evidence of obstruction of justice, leaving Congress to do its duty. We shall not shrink from that duty. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of inquiry over on your left.
Gentleman will state his point of inquiry.
Was the point of this hearing to get Mr. Mueller to recommend impeachment?
That is not a fair point of inquiry. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, wait
Director Mueller,
Mr. Chairman.
to your
The gentlelady from
so
Florida
much
is recognized.
for coming here. You're a patriot. I want to refer you now to Volume 2, page 158. You wrote that, quote, the president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that is largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out orders or accede to his requests. Is that right?
That is accurate, and that is what we found.
And you're basically referring to senior advisors who disobeyed the president's orders, like White House counsel Don McGahn, former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski. Is that right?
Well, we have not specified the persons mentioned.
Well, in page 158, White House counsel Don McGahn, quote, did not tell the acting attorney general that the special counsel must be removed, but was instead prepared to resign over the president's orders. You also explained that an attempt to obstruct justice does not have to succeed to be a crime, right?
True.
Simply attempting to obstruct justice can be a crime, correct?
Yes.
So even though the president's aides refused to carry out his orders to interfere with your investigation, that is not a defense to obstruction of justice by this president, is it?
I'm not going to speculate.
So to reiterate, simply trying to obstruct justice can be a crime, correct?
Yes.
And you say that the president's efforts to influence the investigation were, quote, mostly unsuccessful. And that's because not
Debbie McCarson-Powell,
all of his efforts
representative from Dade County in Miami,
You're
Democrat.
reading into what we've written in the report.
I was going to ask you if you could just tell me which ones you had in mind as successful when you wrote that sentence.
I'm going to pass on that.
Yeah. Director Mueller, today we've talked a lot about the separate acts by this president, but you also wrote in your report that, quote, the overall pattern of the president's conduct towards the investigations can shed light on the nature of the president's acts, and the inferences can be drawn about his intent, correct?
Accurate recitation from the report.
Right, and on page 158, again, I think it's important for everyone to note that the president's conduct had a significant change when he realized that the investigations were conducted to investigate his obstruction acts. So in other words, when the American people are deciding whether the president committed obstruction of justice, they need to look at all of the president's conduct and overall pattern of behavior. Is that correct?
I don't disagree.
Thank you. Dr. Mueller, Director Mueller, doctor also, I'll designate that too. I have certainly made up my mind about whether what we have reviewed today meets the elements of obstruction, including whether there was corrupt intent. And what is clear is that anyone else, including some members of Congress, would have been charged with crimes for these acts. We would not have allowed this behavior from any of the previous 44 presidents. We should not allow it now or for the future to protect our democracy. And yes, we will continue to investigate because, as you clearly state at the end of your report, no one is above the law. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Texas.
Powell won by 0.9% of the vote in 2018, the first time she had run. She's one of the swing district Democrats who will be pivotal in any decision, not only any control of Congress, but also any decision for articles of impeachment. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. More importantly, perhaps today, or more specifically at least, you're listening to Robert Mueller's investigation, his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee. I'm Jefferson Smith, sitting in with a little Mystery Politics Theater 3000. We're going to be right back after the break. During the break, be thinking about stuff you want us to make sure we cover when there's a longer break to discuss it. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Jeff. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program, Mueller edition. We'll be right back.
Potentially preempt constitutional processes for addressing presidential misconduct, end quote. For the non-lawyers in the room, what did you mean by, quote, potentially preempt constitutional processes?
I'm not going to try to explain that.
That actually is coming from page 1 of volume 2. In the footnote is the reference to this. What are those constitutional processes?
I think I heard you mention at least one.
Impeachment, correct?
I'm not going to comment.
Okay, that is one of the constitutional processes listed in the report in the footnote in Volume 2. Your report documents the many ways the president sought to interfere with your investigation. And you state in your report on page 10, Volume 2, that interfering with a congressional inquiry or investigation with corrupt intent can also constitute obstruction of justice.
True.
Well, the president has told us that he intends to fight all the subpoenas. His continued efforts to interfere with investigations of his potential misconduct certainly reinforce the importance of the process the Constitution requires to, quote, formally accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing, as you cited in the report. And this hearing has been very helpful to this committee as it exercises its constitutional duty to determine whether to recommend articles of impeachment against the president. I agree with you, Director Mueller, that we all have a vital role in holding this president accountable for his actions. More than that, I believe we in Congress have a duty to demand accountability and safeguard one of our nation's highest principles, that no one is above the law. From everything that I have heard you say here today, it's clear that anyone else would have been prosecuted based on the evidence available in your report. It now falls on us to hold President Trump accountable. Thank you for being here. Chairman, I yield back.
Verona Escobar also won for the first time in 2018 as the county commissioner from El Paso.
Just a point of privilege, you and I agree.
Point of personal privilege.
I just want to thank the chairman. We did get in our time after this was first developed.
Seeberger.
We did both get in time. Our side got our 5 minutes in. Also, Mr. Mueller, thank you for being here. And I join the chairman and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Director Mueller, we thank you for attending today's hearing. Before we conclude, I ask everyone to please remain seated and quiet while the witness exits the room. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. And without objection, the hearing is now adjourned.
All right, folks. The hearing is now adjourned to the Judiciary Committee. What's going to happen now is a little bit of break while Robert Mueller exits that hearing room, enters another hearing room in order to testify before the Intelligence Committee. The Judiciary Committee is a committee that evaluates various questions, including questions like, I don't know, whether or not they're going to file articles of impeachment. The Intelligence Committee is the kind of committee that investigates things like, I don't know, whether or not there was foreign interference in an election. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jefferson Smith, sitting in, focusing on the Robert Mueller testimony today. The call-in number during breaks is 202-808-9925, and we'll be right back. Howdy, everybody. We're back. We are in a break. Robert Mueller has just ended his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee. He is now changing hearing rooms so he can testify before the House Intelligence Committee. The House Judiciary Committee is the committee that evaluates not only questions of a variety of questions before the American judiciary and system of laws, but also, and specifically, I know for a lot of listeners to this program, whether or not articles of impeachment will be filed against the President of the United States. The Intelligence Committee investigates a different array of questions and will be more focused upon whether or not and to what degree there was an invasion of an attack on interference with the American election. One thing we have right now is a clip. Now, most of what we know is happening in the testimony, and we knew this was going to happen prior. One thing has surprised me a little bit, but I shouldn't be surprised by that by now. The unsurprising thing is that Robert Mueller has been circumspect in his answers. He has offered truncated answers. He has been very brief. He has said mostly, refer to the report. I don't want to comment on matters outside the report. And by the way, if I'm referring to matters inside the report, well, they speak for themselves. That creates almost an iron triangle of trying to get additional information or shed some light on that information. At the very least, it is useful to remind the American people, to get clarified with the American people who watch this, more people watching this and never read the report, about whether or not there was an array of obstruction of justice charges that would have been brought but for Department of Justice policy saying that they won't indict a sitting president of the United States. And by the way, Department of Justice policy is not the same as congressional law. It's not the same as the Constitution. It's not the same as legal principle. It's just the decision by this Department of Justice, this Republican Department of Justice, that they won't indict this sitting president. And the question is whether underlying that, one of the core questions facing the American people is, are there sufficient crimes that have been committed that would have been charged under other circumstances in the absence of that Department of Justice policy, that Attorney General Barr policy? He didn't invent the policy. He is seeing it through, however. Or, and therefore, whether there needs to be some other remedy. The other two remedies are, should this president be indicted after leaving office? And or should this president have to answer to articles of impeachment? Those are the alternative two parts, two pathways towards some degree of accountability. There has been at least one question that was interesting when that I found particularly interesting. The thing I was going to say that I found surprising, but I shouldn't, is the degree to which Republican members of Congress have been attacking Robert Mueller. Lifelong Republican, worked in Republican administrations, received a Bronze Star, has not gone significantly beyond the bounds of his purview to attack this president, hasn't done nearly as much as folks like Sarah Kendzior and others wishes he might to be a Nazi hunter. But nonetheless, they have, and while they have said, oh, there's nothing to see here, somehow they see there's nothing to see here, and yet they also spend almost all of their time and almost all of their questions attacking the investigation. I found that a little bit surprising. I maybe shouldn't. But there's been at least one answer to one question that is pretty darn important that Robert Mueller offered pretty quickly, pretty candidly. And let's play that clip right now.
Was there sufficient evidence to convict President Trump or anyone else with obstruction of justice?
We did not make that calculation.
How could you not have made the calculation with the regulation?
The OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel, indicates that we cannot indict a sitting president. So one of the tools that a prosecutor would use is not there.
Could you charge the president with a crime after he left office?
Yes.
You believe that you could charge the president of the United States with obstruction of justice after he left office?
Yes, but the OLC opinion says that the prosecutor, while he cannot bring a charge against the sitting president, nonetheless it can continue the investigation to see if there are any other persons who might be drawn into the conspiracy.
Let's be clear. That is an enormous moment. Because of the, I'd call it maybe legalistic language of the report, because it was in a written report, because Robert Mueller is, while strong-jawed, a pretty soft-spoken person. Because of the, because I just have to call them lies of the president and the Republican apparatus. It has been, because there have been so many false tweets that have said no obstruction, no justice, no justice, Freudian slip, no obstruction, no collusion, nothing to see or full exoneration. Each of those just patently false. It has clouded what Robert Mueller just said. Let's be clear. And we're going to play that clip again because it is so enormously important. What he just said was the reason they did not indict, the reason they did not fully evaluate the question of indicting was because of the policy. Not exoneration, but because of the policy. Because this president, under that policy, is, for the time being, above the law. He also said that there were grounds, that there was justification for, that it would be allowed to indict the president after he weren't president any longer. That's a big deal. So the question is raised, are those crimes that could be indicted when the president left office or when he leaves office that can't be indicted now under this Department of Justice policy, not the law, not the Constitution, just their policy, their choice, their repeated choice, not just choice in this instance, their repeated choice not to indict. But just because of that policy that is blocking the ability to indict the president, once that policy is no longer in place, that he could be and would be indicted, maybe even should be indicted, the question then comes for the Congress, is that the kind of thing that qualifies as high crimes and misdemeanors? We know that that question is foreclosed for Fox News. We know that that question is foreclosed for every member of the Republican Party in Congress. I think every single one. Justin Amash is no longer a Republican. I think almost none of them read the report. I haven't heard in question. Lindsey Graham said didn't read the report repeatedly over and over, say didn't read the report. But we know the question is foreclosed for them. The question is not foreclosed for the American people. It's not foreclosed for Congress. And Robert Mueller just gave, despite all of his truncated, circumspect answers, maybe the most important answer he could have given to any question. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. We're going to be right back after this break. Thanks for being with us.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann Show. It is the day of Robert Mueller's testimony. We'll be back with that testimony and some commentary when time permits right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Us versus them, the failure of globalism by Ian Bremmer. This is from Chapter 1, titled Winners and Losers. It's time for a local revolution, the candidate told the roaring crowd. Countries are no longer nations, but markets. Borders are erased. Everyone can come to our country, and this has cut our salaries and our social protections. This dilutes our cultural identity. Marine Le Pen's 4 sentences capture every important element of the anxiety rising across the Western world. The borders are open and the foreigners are coming. They'll steal your job. They will cost you your pension and your health care by bankrupting your system. They will pollute your culture. Some of them are killers. Le Pen fell short in her bid to become France's president in 2017, but her message remains compelling for the 21st century politics of us versus them. But this is not a story about Marine Le Pen or Donald J. Trump or any of the other populist powerhouses who have emerged in Europe and the United States in recent years. Spin the camera toward the furious crowd. There's the real story. It's not the messenger that drives this movement. It's the fears, often, if not always, justified, of ordinary people. Fears of lost jobs, surging waves of strangers, vanishing national identities, and the incomprehensible public violence associated with terrorism. It's the growing doubt among citizens that government can protect them, provide them with opportunities for a better life, and help them remain the masters of their fate. As of December 2015, just 6% of people in the United States, 4% in Germany, 4% in Britain, and 3% in France believe the world is getting better. The pessimistic majority suspects that those with power, money, and influence care more about their cosmopolitan world than they do about their fellow citizens. Many citizens of these countries now believe that globalization works for the favored few, but not for them. And they have a point. Globalization, the cross-border flow of ideas, information, money, people, goods, and services, has resulted in an interconnected world where national leaders have increasingly limited ability to protect the lives and livelihoods of their citizens. In the digital age, borders no longer mean what citizens think they mean. In some ways, they barely exist. Globalism, the belief that the interdependence that created globalization is a good thing, is indeed the ideology of the elite. Political leaders of the wealthy West have been globalism's biggest advocates, building a system that has propelled ideas, information, people, money, goods, and services across borders at a speed and on a scale without precedent in human history. Sure, more than 1 billion people have risen from poverty in recent decades, and economies and markets have come a long way from the financial crisis. But along with new opportunities come serious vulnerabilities, and the refusal of the global elite to acknowledge the downsides of the new interdependence confirms the suspicions of those losing their sense of security and standard of living that elites in New York and Paris have more in common with elites in Rome and San Francisco than with their discarded countrymen in Tulsa, Turin, Tuscaloosa, and Toulon. The globalists gutted the American working class and created a middle class in Asia, former White House strategist Steve Bannon told The Hollywood Reporter a few days after Donald Trump's 2016 election victory. The issue is now about Americans looking not to get effed over. End of quote. In the United States, the jobs that once lifted generations of Americans into the middle class and kept them there for life are vanishing. Crime and drug addiction are rising. While 87% of Chinese and 74% of Indians told pollsters in 2017 that they believe their country is moving in the right direction, only 43% of Americans said the same thing. In Europe, the European Commission and the unelected bureaucrats who enforce its rules have legislated for its 28-member nations without understanding their very needs. In recent years, they've failed to halt a debt crisis that has forced many Europeans to accept lower wages, higher prices, later retirement, less generous pensions, and an uncertain future, all while telling them that they must bail out foreign countries that have spent their way into debt. In the migrant crisis, globalist European leaders insisted that all EU members must accept Muslim refugees in numbers determined in Brussels, and barricades and a spike in nationalism were the result. I'm defining nationalism here as one form of us versus them intended to rally members of one nation against those of other nations. Were the wave of populist nationalism sweeping the United States and Europe only signs of globalism's failure, it would be bad enough. But there's a larger crisis coming. Many of the storms creating turmoil in the U.S. and Europe, particularly technological change in the workplace, broader awareness of income inequality, are now headed across borders and into the developing world, where governments and institutions are not ready. Developing countries are especially vulnerable because the institutions that create stability in developing countries are not as sturdy, and social safety nets aren't nearly as strong as in the United States and the European Union. They face an even bigger gap between rich and poor, and the reality that new technologies will kill large numbers of jobs that lifted expectations for a better life will be much harder to manage. In short, just as the financial crisis had a cascading effect through financial markets and real economies around the world, so the sources of anger convulsing Europe and America will send shockwaves through dozens of other countries. Some will absorb these shocks, some of them won't. As poorer people in developing countries become more aware of what they're missing or losing, many will pick up rocks. The book, Us versus Them by Ian Bremmer.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. We are covering the Mueller report, the Mueller testimony today before congressional committees. We're in a break right now in between the House Judiciary testimony and the House Intelligence Committee testimony. We will get back to that House Intelligence Committee testimony almost immediately upon it happening. Right now, the scheduled time is a little bit off. They want to give, presumably, Robert Mueller a little bit of time to go to the restroom, have a sandwich, get ready to be insulted by Republicans, and to offer truncated and circumspect, let's call them short answers to most people's questions, and offer not a whole lot of brand new facts, but some new interesting dynamics, and at least one really important moment. We want to play that moment again right now. We're going to play it a couple more times because if only so that you share it with friends and other people share it with friends. This is an enormous thing. It's distracted by so much noise in the world, and it can be hard. The report can be confusing. We have a caller who called in to say it seems like Robert Mueller wanted the report to be confusing. Setting that aside for just one moment, let's hear this clip. This is not very confusing.
Was there sufficient evidence to convict President Trump or anyone else with obstruction of justice?
We did not make that calculation.
How could you not have made the calculation with the regulations?
The OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel, indicates that we cannot indict a sitting president. So one of the tools that a prosecutor would use is not there.
Could you charge the president with a crime after he left office?
Yes.
You believe that you could charge the President of the United States with obstruction of justice after he left office?
Yes, but the OLC opinion says that the prosecutor, while he cannot bring a charge against the sitting president, nonetheless continue the investigation to see if there are any other persons who might be drawn into the conspiracy.
Okay, I hope you caught that. You could charge this president after he leaves office with obstruction of justice. And the reason they did not is because of the OLC opinion, an opinion of policy, not a law or constitutional principle, that a sitting president will not be, by this particular Department of Justice, indicted during their term of service, during their term of office. That is an enormous moment in American democracy. For some of the questioners who include and recognize the political dynamic here. You've got 90 plus Democrats who said, yeah, I'm ready to vote for articles of impeachment. I'm ready to at least begin impeachment proceedings. And it is such a challenging political question about whether to bring impeachment proceedings. I try not to throw too many stones to people who land on different sides, who think this president shouldn't be above the law, but who recognize that the Senate has already made up their mind. At least Mitch McConnell has made up his mind, because he's not making the decision based on facts or rule of law. That may seem a little bit too critical, but that is my analysis. That is my conclusion. And therefore, is it worth it? Arguments in favor we'll be getting through as we have time today. That debate is going to rage. But part of the political dynamic and the Elizabeth Warren position is this should not be merely a political question. This should be whether or not you believe these qualify as rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors, and vote for that, yay or nay, or live with the result for the rest of your life. Or I suppose, and live with that result for the rest of your life. And have to be comfortable with that vote. And so ultimately it's not merely a political question, but it includes being a political question. And part of the political question is you have representatives like Debbie McCarcel-Powell, who is elected from a swing district in Miami-Dade County. How swing? Well, it was represented by a Republican until just last year. And she won with 50.9% of the vote. At a time when there was a near wave election, I think it's fair to say a wave election for Democrats. And in a wave election for Democrats, she didn't quite get 51%. And she testified, or rather she, in her question time, said there's enough information here to say there should have been charges brought, or should be charges brought, or there was indictable offense brought with respect to obstruction of justice. And so some of the dynamic is a vote count dynamic. It is whether or not representatives like Debbie McCarcel-Powell and the proxy that she offers, other folks who are in challenging districts that in fact might have voted for Trump in 2016 and have constituents who listen to Fox News or watch Fox News and listen to right-wing radio. And whether those folks will say, yeah, you know what, it is my duty to at least have there be articles of impeachment. That's one of the big dynamics. We have time for a couple calls. We'll take the person who's been waiting the longest, who is Renee, who is watching us on YouTube from St. Louis, Missouri. Thank you so much, Renee.
How are you today?
The proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We will see how I am. How are you?
Okay, 10 seconds, real short. Impeach, indict, get rid of him. He's sloppy. Leave Hillary out of it. Okay, we are talking about his crimes. The whole Trump administration, they're just sloppy. And they've got proof numerous times. It doesn't take 400 pages nor 10 indictments. And I still want to know, what were the 7 other cases that Barr dismissed or threw away? Because that is 10 and 7. Isn't that 17 times? I rest my case.
Thank you, Renee. We appreciate the call.
Thank you.
Let's bring on Peter from Chicago. Wins the Most Patient Listener Award now. Go ahead, Peter.
Hello, Jefferson. How are you?
Holding up.
I think the Democrats did a disservice to Bob Mueller. He has had a stellar career, and unfortunately his legacy is going to be stammering, confused, Alzheimer's, unsure. I thought I was listening to Dick Kay the way he was talking. I mean, it was pathetic. And it's unfortunate that this man who has such an illustrious career has to be dragged up here by the Democrats to go over what's in the report if they would have just read it, and they don't read it, and they just want him to say it, which he's not doing, as you know.
So your impression is that the members of the committee, and you think it's them that are hurting Mueller's reputation, but the members of the committee brought him before
brought him up, Jefferson.
that he was brought before the committee because they didn't read the report. That's your impression?
To the committee, so they can get him hopefully to say yes, he needs to be impeached. And the clip you keep playing, what you're leaving out, Jefferson, is the fact that he was asked directly, as a prosecutor, is it ethical to bring up innuendo about someone unless you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they committed the crime? And he said no.
Wait, what? Peter, I think what you just said is patently inaccurate. The clip we played did not say that, and the clip we played, and nor are we talking about innuendo. What we're talking about is whether or not the OLC opinion was in fact the reason why there was not a conclusion brought, there was not an indictment brought with respect to obstruction of justice. Is that part lost on you, or are you just?
No, it's not lost, Jefferson. But what you're missing is when he was asked directly, as a prosecutor, is it ethical for you to make innuendo about a defendant that you cannot prove?
But what's the relevance of that, Peter?
A reasonable doubt, and he didn't do it.
Why is that relevant?
Because the whole obstruction of justice, he wasn't even. I mean, that was clearly laid out that wasn't even something he needed to go into. Or
Peter, I got to let you go. What you're saying is outright false, like totally false. Obstruction of justice is absolutely one of the things he had to go into. One of the things they did go into. One of the things they offered various predicates in the report that he has testified today about some of those. That question, that critical question, had nothing to do with innuendo. And I recognize for Trump supporters, this can be uncomfortable. It is there is so much commitment to the current president by people who voted for him. And I know that every time somebody criticizes him, every time somebody says, no, it was all a Russian plot, they say, well, my vote wasn't a Russian plot. I couldn't have been manipulated by anybody. Anytime they say this guy's a racist, they say, oh, I'm not a racist. I would not be a racist. And it only digs in their support further. Every time a woman comes out and says, this guy's not only a racist, he's also a rapist. So he says, oh, well, I never would have voted for a rapist. And it digs them in further their position. It only increases the commitment of that 35 to 40+% of the population who's committed to this guy. 96% of the Republican Party. I get that dynamic. And I also get, I'm not going to persuade you. But let's at least be committed to facts. Let's at least be committed to accuracy. And if we're committed to facts and accuracy, this wasn't about innuendo. This wasn't about elements that weren't within the purview of the special counsel. Obstruction of justice absolutely was within the purview of this investigation. What has now been made clear is that it wasn't merely some concern with basic legal ethics or some concern with harming someone's name, but the reason there was no indictment brought was because of an OLC opinion that said no indictment against the sitting president, that said the only options for accountability are either impeachment or I should suggest indictment after the president is out of office. That's what's going on. That's the whole thing. And that was clear, I think, to people who read the report. It was not clear to people who read only Attorney General Barr's cover-up memo. But it's pretty clear to people who read the report, or people who've listened, as I have, to much of or most of or all of Thom Hartmann's reading of the Mueller report during breaks, which are available right now on YouTube if you'd like to watch them. What makes clear is that we can move beyond innuendo. We can move beyond partisan bickering. We can move beyond who we voted for and who we wish were president, who we wish weren't president. But now we understand that there is sufficient information to indict this guy on obstruction of justice. Let's at least be committed to those facts, not to convict necessarily. That happens after indictment, but to indict. And that's what articles of impeachment would do, is give us that opportunity. We'll be back. This is Thom Hartmann.
Yeah. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. We'll be right back after this. Let's listen to Art from Chicago, Illinois, listening to WCPT Ain't Afraid of Me. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for calling. What's your impression so far, Art?
Well, when it comes to the OLC, he's told Mueller has told Barr repeatedly that the OLC had nothing to do with him not indicting Trump.
We know he's told Barr what? Like, you were in the room when he said this? Like, what do we know? We know this because that's what Barr said?
Holy cow, have you not been paying attention to all the news media and everything? Barr himself has stood there.
No, I recognize. I recognize that Barr is covering for the president, saying there's nothing to see here, and wrote a memo that had to be corrected by the people who actually did the investigation. That I understand Barr's position. Why do you think that Barr's position resolves the question?
It's OLC. Yeah, of course. Hang up on me, you piece of shit.
Whoa, I hadn't hung up on you. You did curse on the air, and I think we dumped that, but you were still on the air when you offered your curse word. I think we were able to catch it so it didn't violate FCC regulations. I understand this stuff is angering. Understand the anger of people who are defending the president is matched multiple fold by people who are deeply concerned that the overall system of justice is being subverted by this president and by the apparatus defending him. And yeah, that does include people who attack members of the news media, who attack other members of Congress, who do call in angrily to this radio program and curse even though they didn't get hung up on. Like, I recognize that. It's sort of a dangerous thing. But let's be clear, unless, and if I'm misinterpreting the quote that we're playing, let me know. One of the reasons I'm playing it more than once is to make sure I didn't miss something. To be clear, I didn't think there'd be any hot moments this morning. I really didn't. I anticipated, and still anticipate, going forward, Robert Mueller answering questions mostly with a shade of one of two answers. Either that's beyond the ambit of the report, and I'm not going to talk about anything beyond the ambit of the report. The other answer would be, oh, well, that's in the report, and I don't need to rehash anything that's in the report. And that duopoly of responses would block additional information, additional light being shed. The reason we're playing that clip is to make sure I didn't miss something, to make sure I'm not misinterpreting something. Right? This is all happening real time for all of us. But I don't think I'm misinterpreting it. I think what he said, I mean, we can play it again, but I'm pretty sure what he said was that the reason they didn't make a determination of whether he could be convicted was because there was no indictment. The reason there was no indictment was because of the OLC opinion. And that there could be an indictment of this president after the president left office. I don't think I'm reading into that. I don't think that's merely my cognitive dissonance kicking in. I don't think that's merely the fact that I'm not a big fan of this president kicking in. I think I heard that playing. We'll try to keep it respectful here. We appreciate you listening. I'm honored to be here. My name's Jeff. You're listening to Thom Hartmann Show. We'll be right back after this break. And we're back. You're listening to the Hartmann Show. Thom Hartmann is away for right now. I'm Jefferson Smith. I'm sitting in. I'm honored to be here. Thanks so much. We'll be going back to, as soon as it begins, the testimony before the House Intelligence Committee. I'll be looking from time to time at the screen to see when they've in fact gotten started. And they'll be telling me when they've gotten started so we can go back to that. We'll be offering some very brief comments in between that, including to be able to introduce who's speaking from time to time, including to offer occasionally mystery, politics, science, theater 3000 comments by me, and offering some of them also by you. Why don't we take, while we have a moment, some calls. We've got Barbara from Sun City, Arizona. Go ahead, Barbara.
Hi. Basically, what I'm trying to, I got this yesterday, that if Mueller doesn't testify to the parts of the report that are redacted by Barr in order to cover Trump's crimes, then it's obstruction of justice, protecting obstruction of justice by committing obstruction of justice. It's like they're all covering for each other and they're all obstructing justice. And it's so wrong, and we need somebody like the Pentagon Papers to come and take the whole unredacted thing and, throw it into the Washington Post and let everybody see what really happened. And we know what really happened, the Magnitsky, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sanctions on Russia, why they did it, what's been going on for years.
Appreciate the call, Barbara. Let's take a call from Stan from Champaign, Illinois, WCPT. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks. If Trump is reelected next year, the statute of limitations is going to run on almost all of the charges that he could be prosecuted for when he's not president. So we have to have impeachment. And if Nancy Pelosi has any ability to get her caucus to do what she wants, she should be able to say impeach, and they'll all follow her.
No, there is, and thanks, Stan, for the call. There is a real risk, and I want to respond also to Barbara's call. I want to get to as many of your calls as we can during this short break. But there is a real risk that if we can't sufficiently trust that our elections will be majoritarian, that the person who ends up sitting in the White House is not supported by a majority of the American people, or even the majority of the votes cast, or even a plurality of the votes cast. They can come in second and sit in the White House. And if that can happen in an era of unlimited secret money, in an era of voter suppression, in an era of partisan gerrymandering and an electoral college that doesn't reflect the overall will of the overall American people, and if all of that is happening, there is a real possibility that we should be stealing ourselves towards. And this is why my own view is that save democracy, it ain't about one president. It ain't about one Congress. It is, and all of our attention shouldn't be focused there. In fact, during the time I'm sitting in, we're going to be talking about state legislative races that could impact the overall structure of Congress for the coming decade. We've got to be playing a long game, a long pro-democracy game, not merely towards not merely with an eye to a single election or a single president, because there is a real risk, as you said, that accountability for this president will mean, I don't know, some people saying mean things in history books and other loyalist folks saying nice things about him in history, talk radio. Let's go right now. They just started. Adam Schiff is talking. They haven't begun the questioning, but they have introduced the panel. They're introducing right now. This is the House Intelligence Committee testimony of Robert Mueller and the questions thereof. We'll be back. This is Tom's show. I'm Jeff, sitting in. Honored to be here.
Knew that a foreign power was intervening in our election and welcomed it, built Russian meddling into their strategy, and used it. Disloyalty to country. Those are strong words, but how else are we to describe a presidential campaign which did not inform the authorities of a foreign offer of dirt on their opponent, which did not publicly shun it or turn it away, but which instead invited it, encouraged it, and made full use of it? That disloyalty may not have been criminal, constrained by uncooperative witnesses, the destruction of documents, and the use of encrypted communications. Your team was not able to establish each of the elements of the crime of conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt, so not a provable crime in any event. But I think maybe something worse. A crime is the violation of law written by Congress, but disloyalty to country violates the very oath of citizenship, our devotion to a core principle on which our nation was founded, that we, the people, and not some foreign power that wishes us ill, we decide who governs us. This is also a story about money, about greed and corruption, about the leadership of a campaign willing to compromise the nation's interest, not only to win, but to make money at the same time. About a campaign chairman indebted to pro-Russian interests who tried to use his position to clear his debts and make millions. about a national security advisor using his position to make money from still other foreign interests, and about a candidate trying to make more money than all of them put together through a real estate project that to him was worth a fortune, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the realization of a lifelong ambition, a Trump Tower in the heart of Moscow. A candidate who, in fact, viewed his whole campaign as the greatest infomercial in history. Donald Trump and his senior staff were not alone in their desire to use the election to make money. For Russia, too, there was a powerful financial motive. Putin wanted relief from U.S. economic sanctions imposed in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and over human rights violations. The secret Trump Tower meeting between the Russians and senior campaign officials was about sanctions. The secret conversations between Flynn and the Russian ambassador were about sanctions. Trump and his team wanted more money for themselves, and the Russians wanted more money for themselves and for their oligarchs. But the story doesn't end here either. For your report also tells a story about lies. Lots of lies. Lies about a gleaming...
We're going to break. We'll be right back with Mueller's testimony. Almost wish this one would have been before the first one, because remember, this isn't really just about Donald Trump. It's about corruption. It's about subversion of elections. It's about how we protect the sanctity of democracy. We're going to be right back on Tom's Show. I'm Jeff. You're you. Thanks so much.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Lies to obstruct an investigation into the most serious attack on our democracy by a foreign power in our history. That is where your report ends, Director Mueller, with a scheme to cover up, obstruct, and deceive every bit as systematic and pervasive as the Russian disinformation campaign itself, but far more pernicious since this rot came from within. Even now, after 448 pages and 2 volumes, the deception continues. The president and his acolytes say your report found no collusion, though your report explicitly declined to address that question, since collusion can involve both criminal and non-criminal conduct. Your report laid out multiple offers of Russian help to the Trump campaign, the campaign's acceptance of that help, and overt acts in furtherance of Russian help. To most Americans, that is the very definition of collusion, whether it is a crime or not. They say your report found no evidence of obstruction, though you outline numerous actions by the president intended to obstruct the investigation. They say the president has been fully exonerated, though you specifically declare you could not exonerate him. In fact, they say your whole investigation was nothing more than a witch hunt, that the Russians didn't interfere in our election, that it's all a terrible hoax. The real crime, they say, is not that the Russians intervened to help Donald Trump, but that the FBI had the temerity to investigate it when they did. But worst of all, worse than all the lies and the greed, is the disloyalty to country. For that too continues. When asked if the Russians intervene again, will you take their help, Mr. President? Why not? Was the essence of his answer. Everyone does it. No, Mr. President, they don't. Not in the America envisioned by Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. Not for those who believe in the idea that Lincoln labored until his dying day to preserve, the idea animating our great national experiment, so unique then, so precious still, that our government is chosen by our people through our franchise and not by some hostile foreign power. This is what is at stake. Our next election and the one after that, for generations to come, our democracy. This is why your work matters, Director Mueller. This is why our investigation matters, to bring these dangers to light. Ranking Member Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, everyone, to the last gasp of the Russia collusion conspiracy theory. As Democrats continue to foist this spectacle on the American people, as well as you, Mr. Mueller, the American people may recall the media first began spreading this conspiracy theory in the spring of 2016, when Fusion GPS, funded by the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign, started developing the Steele dossier, a collection of outlandish accusations that Trump and his associates were Russian agents. Fusion GPS, Steele, and other Confederates fed these absurdities to naive or partisan reporters and to top officials in numerous government agencies, including the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the State Department. Among other things, the FBI used dossier allegations to obtain a warrant to spy on the Trump campaign. Despite acknowledging dossier allegations as being salacious and unverified, former FBI Director James Comey briefed those allegations to President Obama and President-elect Trump. Those briefings conveniently leaked to the press, resulting in the publication of the dossier and launching thousands of false press stories based on the word of a foreign ex-spy, one who admitted he was desperate that Trump lose the election and who was eventually fired as an FBI source for leaking to the press. After Comey himself was fired, by his own admission, he leaked derogatory information on President Trump to the press for the specific purpose, and successfully so, of engineering the appointment of a special counsel who sits here before us today. The FBI investigation was marred by further corruption and bizarre abuses. Top DOJ official Bruce Orr, whose own wife worked on Fusion GPS's anti-Trump operation, fed Steele's information to the FBI even after the FBI fired Steele. The top FBI investigator and his lover, another top FBI official, constantly texted about how much they hated Trump and wanted to stop him from being elected. And the entire investigation was opened based not on Five Eyes intelligence, but on a tip from a foreign politician about a conversation involving Joseph Mifsud. He's a Maltese diplomat who's widely portrayed as a Russian agent, but seems to have far more connections with Western governments, including our own FBI and our own State Department, than with Russia. Brazenly ignoring all these red flags, as well as the transparent absurdity of the claims they are making, the Democrats have argued for nearly 3 years that evidence of collusion is hidden just around the corner. Like the Loch Ness Monster, they insist it's there, even if no one can find it. Consider this. In March 2017, Democrats on this committee said they had more than circumstantial evidence of collusion, but they couldn't reveal it yet. Mr. Mueller was soon appointed, and they said he would find the collusion. Then when no collusion was found in Mr. Mueller's indictments, the Democrats said we'd find it in his final report. Then when there was no collusion in the report, we were told Attorney General Barr was hiding it. Then when it was clear Barr wasn't hiding anything, we were told it will be revealed through a hearing with Mr. Mueller himself. And now that Mr. Mueller is here, they are claiming that the collusion has actually been in his report all along, hidden in plain sight. And they're right. There is collusion in plain sight. Collusion between Russia and the Democratic Party. The Democrats colluded with Russian sources to develop the Steele dossier, and Russian lawyer Natalia Vesnitskaya colluded with the dossier's key architect, Fusion GPS head Glenn Simpson. The Democrats have already admitted, both in interviews and through their usual anonymous statements to reporters, that today's hearing is not about getting information at all. They said they want to, quote, bring the Mueller report to life and create a television moment through ploys like having Mr. Mueller recite passages from his own report. In other words, this hearing is political theater. It's a Hail Mary attempt to convince the American people
this distinction
that
between
collusion
internal and
is
external
real
taxes seems to be the
and that it's concealed
today,
in the
as
report.
It did to so many in that day.
Granted, that's a strange argument to make about a report that is public. It's almost like the Democrats prepared arguments accusing Mr. Barr of hiding the report and didn't bother to update their claims once he published the entire thing. Among congressional Democrats, the Russia investigation was never about finding the truth. It's always been a simple...
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Hello, everybody. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jefferson Smith. We're going to be going to questions of Bob Mueller in front of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff's committee. Remember when we do this, that in so many of the most important respects, none of this investigation has been really about Donald Trump. It hasn't been about his tax dodging to build his real estate empire. It hasn't been about various allegiances he's had with unsavory characters in the United States. Let's go right now. I just got the note through my ear that Adam Schiff is talking before the committee. We're going to be hearing that. I'll be offering some commentary and occasionally taking your comments. You can also tweet me at Jefferson D. Smith. Let's go to Adam Schiff right now.
After each member has asked his or her questions, the ranking member will be afforded an additional 5 minutes to ask questions, followed by the chair who will have additional 5 minutes for questions. The ranking member and the chair will not be permitted to delegate or yield our final round of questions to any other member. After 6 members of the majority and 6 members of the minority have concluded their 5-minute rounds of questions, we'll take a 5 or 10-minute break that we understand you've requested before resuming the hearing with Congressman Swalwell starting his round of questions. Special Counsel Mueller is accompanied today by Aaron Zebley, who served as Deputy Special Counsel from May 2017 until May 2019 and had day-to-day oversight of the Special Counsel's investigation. Mr. Mueller and Mr. Zebley resigned from the Department of Justice at the end of May 2019 when the Special Counsel's office was closed. Both Mr. Mueller and Mr. Zebley will be available to answer questions today and will be sworn in consistent with the rules of the House and the committee. Mr. Mueller and Mr. Zebley's appearance today before the committee is in keeping with the committee's longstanding practice of receiving testimony from current or former Department of Justice and FBI personnel regarding open and closed investigative matters. As this hearing is under oath and before we begin your testimony, Mr. Mueller and Zebley, would you please rise and raise your right hands to be sworn? Let me swear them in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give at this hearing is the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Thank you. The record will reflect that the witnesses have been duly sworn. Ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify that this is highly unusual for Mr. Zebley to be sworn in. We're here to ask Director Mueller questions. He's here as counsel. Our side is not going to be directing any questions to Mr. Zebley, and we have concerns about his prior representation of the Hillary Clinton campaign aide. So I just want
this
to
is
voice
Devin
that
Nunes,
concern that we do have.
who the move by, and this was reported by Reuters yesterday, the move the Republicans have taken on, the strategy is to try to take down the Mueller investigation. That is their determined strategy.
About being here today, but it is up to this committee and not anyone else who will be allowed to be sworn in and testify, and you are welcome as a private citizen to testify, and members may direct their questions to whoever they choose. With that, Director Mueller, you are recognized for any opening remarks you'd like to make.
Good afternoon, Chairman Schiff, Ranking Member Nunes, and members of the committee. I testified this morning before the House Judiciary Committee. I ask that the opening statement I made before that committee be incorporated into the record here.
Without objection, Director.
I understand that this committee has a unique jurisdiction and that you are interested in further understanding the counterintelligence implications of our investigation. So let me say a word about how we handled the potential impact of our investigation on counterintelligence matters. As we explained in our report, the special counsel regulations effectively gave me the role of United States Attorney. As a result, we structured our investigation around evidence for possible use in prosecution of federal crimes. We did not reach what you would call counterintelligence conclusions. We did, however, set up processes in the office to identify and pass counterintelligence information onto the FBI. Members of our office periodically briefed the FBI about counterintelligence information. In addition, there were agents and analysts from the FBI who were not on our team, but whose job it was to identify counterintelligence information in our files and to disseminate that information to the FBI. For these reasons, questions about what the FBI has done with the counterintelligence information obtained from our investigation should be directed to the FBI. I also want to reiterate a few points that I made this morning. I am not making any judgments or offering opinions about the guilt or innocence in any pending case. It is unusual for a prosecutor to testify about a criminal investigation, and given my role as a prosecutor, there are reasons why my testimony will necessarily be limited. First, public testimony could affect several ongoing matters. In some of these matters, court rules or judicial orders limit the disclosure of information to protect the fairness of the proceedings. And consistent with longstanding Justice Department policy, it would be inappropriate for me to comment in any way that could affect an ongoing matter. Second, the Justice Department has asserted privileges concerning investigative information and decisions, ongoing matters within the Justice Department, and deliberations within our office. These are Justice Department privileges that I will respect. The Department has released a letter discussing the restrictions on my testimony. But I therefore will not be able to answer questions about certain areas that I know are of public interest. For example, I am unable to address questions about the opening of the FBI's Russia investigation, which occurred months before my appointment, or matters related to the so-called Steele dossier. These matters are the subject of ongoing review by the Department. Any questions on these topics should therefore be directed to the FBI or the Justice Department. Third, as I explained this morning, it is important for me to adhere to what we wrote in our report. The report contains our findings and analysis and the reasons for the decisions we made. We stated the results of our investigation with precision. I do not intend to summarize or describe the results of our work in a different way in the course of my testimony today. And as I stated in May, I also will not comment on the actions of the Attorney General or of Congress. I was appointed as a prosecutor, and I intend to adhere to that role and to the Department standards that govern. Finally, as I said this morning, over the course of my career, I have seen a number of challenges to our democracy. The Russian government's efforts to interfere in our election is among the most serious, and I am sure that the committee agrees. Now, before we go to questions, I want to add one correction to my testimony this morning. I want to go back to one thing that was said this morning by Mr. Liu, who said, and I quote, "You didn't charge the president because of the OLC opinion." That is not the correct way to say it. As we say in the report, and as I said at the opening, we did not reach a determination as to whether the president committed a crime. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm ready to answer questions.
Thank you, Director Mueller. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Director Mueller, your report describes a sweeping and systematic effort.
And with that, we're going to break. I'll offer my comment on that last note from Robert Mueller. And that is, in fact, the critique, I think, of Robert Mueller is the decision not to engage that full question because of the OLC memo. But we'll be right back. After this is Tom's Show. I'm Jeff Smith.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. This is Robert Mueller's testimony before the House Intelligence Committee, and we're going to be right back.
Did they not?
I think we have. We report in our in the report indications that that occurred, yes.
The president's son said when he was approached about dirt on Hillary Clinton that the Trump campaign would love it.
That is generally what was said, yes.
The president himself called on the Russians to hack Hillary's emails.
There was a statement by the president in those general lines.
And numerous times during the campaign, the president praised the releases of the Russian-hacked emails through WikiLeaks.
That did occur.
Your report found that the Trump campaign planned, quote, a press strategy, communications campaign, and messaging, unquote, based on that Russian assistance.
I am not familiar with that.
That language comes from Volume 1, page 54. Apart from the Russians wanting to help Trump win, several individuals associated with the Trump campaign were also trying to make money during the campaign and transition. Is that correct?
That is true.
Paul Manafort was trying to make money or achieve debt forgiveness from a Russian oligarch.
Generally, that is accurate.
Michael Flynn was trying to make money from Turkey.
True.
Donald Trump was trying to make millions from a real estate deal in Moscow.
To the extent you're talking about the hotel in Moscow?
Yes.
Yes.
When your investigation looked into these matters, numerous Trump associates lied to your team, the grand jury, and to Congress?
Number of persons that we interviewed in our investigation, it turns out, did lie.
Mike Flynn lied?
He was convicted of lying, yes.
George Papadopoulos was convicted of lying?
True.
Paul Manafort was convicted of lying?
True.
Paul Manafort was, in fact, went so far as to encourage other people to lie?
That is accurate.
Manafort's deputy, Rick Gates, lied?
That is accurate.
Michael Cohen, the president's lawyer, was indicted for lying?
True.
He lied to stay on message with the president?
Allegedly by him.
And when Donald Trump called your investigation a witch hunt, that was also false, was it not?
I'd like to think so, yes.
Well, your investigation is not a witch hunt, is it?
It is not a witch hunt.
When the president said the Russian interference was a hoax, that was false, wasn't it?
True.
When he said it publicly, it was false?
He did say publicly that it was false, yes.
And when he told it to Putin, that was false too, wasn't it?
That I'm not familiar with.
When the president said he had no business dealings with Russia, that was false, wasn't it?
I'm not going to go into the details of the report that along those lines.
Well, when the president said he had no business dealings with Russia, in fact, he was seeking to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, was he not?
I think there is some question about when this was accomplished.
Well, you would consider a billion-dollar deal to build a tower in Moscow to be business dealings, wouldn't you, Director Mueller?
Yeah, absolutely.
In short, your investigation found evidence that Russia wanted to help Trump win the election, right?
I think generally that would be accurate.
Russia informed campaign officials of that?
I'm not certain to what conversations you're referring to.
Well, through an intermediary, they informed Papadopoulos that they could help with the anonymous release of stolen emails?
Accurate.
Russia committed federal crimes in order to help Donald Trump?
When you're talking about the computer crimes charged in our case, absolutely.
The Trump campaign officials built their strategy, their messaging strategy around those stolen documents?
Generally, that's true.
And then they lied to cover it up?
Generally, that's true.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes.
We'll be coming back here in just a second. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. Mueller's testimony. That was Adam Schiff from California. We're back on the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. Devin Nunes, maybe your favorite. He might be your favorite. I'm not sure if he's your favorite. He might be your favorite. He's right now asking questions of Robert Mueller. We're going to listen to those questions.
The office, however, did not investigate who was responsible for inviting these Trump associates to this symposium. Your investigators also failed to interview Stephen Schrage, an American citizen who helped organize the event and invited Carter Page to it. Is that correct?
Can you repeat the question?
Whether or not you interviewed Stephen Schrage, who organized the Cambridge.
In those areas, I am going to stay away from.
The first Trump associate to be investigated was General Flynn. Many of the allegations against him stem from false media reports that he had an affair with a Cambridge academic, Svetlana Lokova, and that Lokova was a Russian spy. Some of these allegations were made public in a 2017 article written by British intelligence historian Christopher Andrew. Your report fails to reveal how or why Andrew and his collaborator,
so Trump and
Richard
Pence
Dearlove, former head of Britain's MI6, spread these allegations.
Saying no collusion, no obstruction, full exoneration. That is their several-word summary of this whole thing. If that is really what the Mueller report said, how come Devin Nunes, or to what degree is Devin Nunes going to spend his time, or Republicans going to spend their time, trying to undermine the investigation, if in fact the investigation was so very good for the president?
Let's continue with the opening of the investigation, supposedly on July 31st, 2016. The investigation was not opened based on an official product from Five Eyes Intelligence, but based on a rumor conveyed by Alexander Downer. On volume 1, page 89, your report describes him blandly as a representative of a foreign government. But he was actually a long-time Australian politician, not a military or intelligence official, who had previously arranged a $25 million donation to the Clinton Foundation and has previous ties to Dearlove. So Downer conveys a rumor he supposedly heard about a conversation between Papadopoulos and Joseph Mifsud. James Comey has publicly called Mifsud a Russian agent, yet your report does not refer to Mifsud as a Russian agent. Mifsud has extensive contacts with Western governments and the FBI. For example, there is a recent photo of him standing next to Boris Johnson, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. What we're trying to figure out here, Mr. Mueller, is if our NATO allies or Boris Johnson have been compromised. So we're trying to figure out, Comey says Mifsud is a Russian agent, you do not. So do you stand by what's in the report?
I stand by that which is in the report, and not so necessarily with that which is not in the report.
I want to return to Mr. Downer. He denies that Papadopoulos mentioned anything to him about Hillary Clinton's emails, and in fact, Mifsud denies mentioning to Papadopoulos. He denies that Papadopoulos mentioned anything to him about Hillary Clinton's emails. And in fact, Mifsud denies mentioning them to Papadopoulos in the first place. So how does the FBI know to continually ask Papadopoulos about Clinton's emails for the rest of 2016? Even more strangely, your sentencing memo on Papadopoulos blames him for hindering the FBI's ability to potentially detain or arrest Mifsud. But the truth is, Mifsud waltzed in and out of the United States in December 2016. The US media could find him, the Italian press found him, and he's a supposed Russian agent at the epicenter of the purported collusion conspiracy. He's the guy who knows about Hillary Clinton's emails and that the Russians have them. But the FBI failed to question him for a half a year after officially opening the investigation. And then according to volume 1, page 193 of your report, once Mifsud finally was questioned, he made false statements to the FBI. But you declined to charge him. Is that correct? You did not indict Mr. Mifsud?
I'm not going to speak to the series of happenings as you articulated them.
But you did not indict Mr. Mifsud?
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Pardon?
You did not indict Mr. Mifsud?
True.
Mr. Himes.
Director Mueller, thank you for your lifetime of service to this country, and thank you for your perseverance and patience today. Director, your report opens with two statements of remarkable clarity and power. The first statement is one that is, as of today, not acknowledged by the President of the United States, and that is, quote, the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. The second statement remains controversial amongst members of this body, same page on your report, and I quote, the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome. Do I have that statement right?
I believe so.
This is Jim Himes.
Director Mueller, this attack on our democracy involved, as you said, two operations. First, a social media disinformation campaign. This was a targeted campaign to spread false information on places like Twitter and Facebook. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Facebook estimated, as per your report, that the Russian fake images reached 126 million people. Is that correct?
I believe that's the sum that we record.
Democrat from
Director,
Connecticut.
who did the Russian social media campaign ultimately intend to benefit? Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump?
Donald Trump.
The second operation, Director...
Let me just say Donald Trump, but there were instances where Hillary Clinton was subject to much the same behavior.
The second operation in the Russian attack was a scheme, what we call the hack and dump, to steal and release hundreds of thousands of emails from the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign. Is that a fair summary?
That is.
Did your investigation find that the releases of the hacked emails were strategically timed to maximize impact on the election?
I'd have to refer you to our report on that question.
Page 36, I quote, "The release of the documents was designed and timed to interfere with the 2016 U.S. presidential election." Mr. Mueller, which presidential candidate was Russia's hacking and dumping operation designed
We'll bring you back in just a moment. This is Jim Himes, congressman from Connecticut, former chair of the New Democrats, sort of adjacent to the Blue Dogs, the more moderate Democrats. How they land on the question of articles of impeachment could be decisive. We'll be right back with Tom's show. I'm Jefferson Smith. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be right back with testimony from Bob Mueller in front of the House Intelligence Committee here on Thom Hartmann's show. I'm Jeff Smith, right after this.
Is that correct?
Could you repeat that question?
Your report describes what is called a third avenue of Russian interference, and that's the links and contacts between the Trump campaign and individuals tied to the Russian government.
Yes.
Let's bring up slide 1, which is about George Papadopoulos, and it reads, on May 6, 2016, 10 days after that meeting with Mifsud, much discussed today, Papadopoulos suggested to a representative of a foreign government that the Trump campaign had received indications from the Russian government that it could assist the campaign through the anonymous release of information that would be damaging to Hillary Clinton. And Director, that's exactly what happened 2 months later, is it not?
Well, I can speak to the excerpt that you have on the screen as being accurate from the report, but not the second half of your question.
Well, the second half, just to refer to page 6 of the report, is that on July 22nd, through WikiLeaks, thousands of these emails that were stolen by the Russian government appeared, correct? That's on page 6 of the report. This is the WikiLeaks posting of those emails.
I can't find it quickly, but please continue.
Okay. So just to be clear, before the public or the FBI ever knew, the Russians previewed for a Trump campaign official, George Papadopoulos, that they had stolen emails that they could release anonymously to help Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. Is that correct?
I'm not going to speak to that.
Director, rather than report this contact with Joseph Mifsud and the notion that there was dirt that the campaign could use, rather than report that to the FBI that I think most of my constituents would expect an individual to do, Papadopoulos in fact lied about his Russian contacts to you. Is that not correct?
That's true.
We have an election coming up in 2020, Director. If a campaign receives an offer of dirt from a foreign individual or a government, generally speaking, should that campaign report those contacts?
Should be. It can be, depending on the circumstances of crime.
I will yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Conaway.
Thank you. Mr. Mueller, did anyone ask you to exclude anything from your report that you felt should have been in the report?
I don't think so, but it's not a small report.
But no one asked you specifically to exclude something that you believe should have been in there?
Not that I can recall, no.
I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Ratcliffe. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Good afternoon, Director Mueller.
In your May 29th press conference, and again in your opening remarks this morning, you made it pretty clear you wanted the special counsel report to speak for itself. You said at your press conference that that was the office's final position, and we will not comment on any other conclusions or hypotheticals about the president. Now, you spent the last few hours of your life from Democrats trying to get you to answer all kinds of hypotheticals about the president, and I expect that it may continue for the next few hours of your life. I think you've stayed pretty much true to what your intent and desire was, but I guess regardless of that, the special counsel's office is closed and it has no continuing jurisdiction or authority. So what would be your authority or jurisdiction for adding new conclusions or determinations to the special counsel's written report?
As to the latter, I don't know or expect changes in conclusions that we included in our report.
So to that point, you addressed one of the issues that I needed to, which was from your testimony this morning, which some construed as a change to the written report. You talked about the exchange that you had with Congressman Lieu. I wrote it down a little bit different. I want to ask you about it so that the record's perfectly clear. I recorded that he asked you, quote, the reason you did not indict Donald Trump is because of the OLC opinion stating you cannot indict a sitting president, to which you responded, that is correct. That response is inconsistent. I think you'll agree with your written report. I want to be clear that it is not your intent to change your written report. It is your intent to clarify the record to that effect.
As I started today, this afternoon, and added either a footnote or an endnote, what I wanted to clarify is the fact that we did not make any determination with regard to culpability in any way. We did not start that process down the road.
Terrific. Thank you for clarifying the record.
John Ratcliffe from Texas.
The stated purpose of your appointment as special counsel
voted
was
by
to ensure a
Heritage
full
Action,
and
their
thorough
final scorecard
investigation
is the
of the
second
Russian
most
government
conservative
efforts to
legislator in the
interfere
country.
in the 2016 presidential election. As part of that full and thorough investigation, what determination did the special counsel office make about whether the Steele dossier was part of the Russian government efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election?
Again, when it comes to Mr. Steele, I defer to the Department of Justice.
Well, first of all, Director, I very much agree with your determination that Russia's efforts were sweeping and systematic. I think it should concern every American. That's why I want to know just how sweeping and systematic those efforts were. I want to find out if Russia interfered with our election by providing false information through sources to Christopher Steele about a Trump conspiracy that you determined didn't exist.
Well, I'm not going to discuss the issues with regard to Mr. Steele. And in terms of a portrayal of the conspiracies, we returned 2 indictments in the computer crimes arena, one GRU and another.
Zach, I'm going to go to you really quick. We've got a caller that has a question that I want to answer when there's just a brief moment. Zach, you got a few seconds for your question from North Hollywood. Zach, you there? Oh, Zach, got to let you go. Question it looked like he was asked was, why wasn't the Department of Justice policy changed after Nixon? I do want to give an answer to that, and then we're going to go back to Republican Ratliff's questioning of Mueller, who the Heritage Action named as the second most conservative legislator in America. But I did want to take that question. So why wasn't the Department of Justice policy? Mueller has said the reason they didn't reach a final determination on Donald Trump's guilt on obstruction of justice was because of Department of Justice policy, the OLC memo that said they can't indict a sitting president. And the question is, why didn't that get changed after Nixon was impeached? I think that there is a somewhat sort of clear answer to that. Because instead what they did was they created the independent counsel statute. The independent counsel statute that was instead used later, of course, to whack Bill Clinton, and then let lapse after that, so it's not in place anymore. The idea was that with an independent counsel statute and the tool of impeachment, that could work. In fact, it looked like, even without the independent counsel statute, that the threat of impeachment could work. Nixon resigned. there is some evidence that, in fact, that mechanism could work. Indeed, it could be argued, and I would argue, that much of the modern right-wing apparatus was built in the wake of that because of that. Much of their criticism of the media was because the media played a meaningful role in marshaling public opinion so that Nixon could be held accountable. And when they said there was a liberal media, one of the things they meant was, well, there's a media that will follow the facts in order to topple Nixon, or a president who needs to be held accountable. And so that's why we now have, linked to why we now have, the apparatus right-wing radio, the apparatus of Fox News, which is clouding the conversation, which means all of this analysis comparing this to Nixon is challenged by the fact that the political dynamics, the media dynamics, are so very different. Let's go back right now to hear Bob Mueller's answers to Congressman Ratcliffe.
But isn't it against the law for a presidential campaign to accept anything of value from a foreign government?
Generally speaking, yes, but generally the cases are unique.
Well, you say in page 184 in volume 1 that the federal campaign finance law broadly
Democrat.
prohibits foreign nationals from making contributions, et cetera. And then you say that foreign nationals may not make a contribution or donation of money or anything of value. It says clearly in the report itself.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, let's turn to what actually happened at the meeting. When Donald Trump Jr. and the others got to the June 9th meeting, they realized that the Russian delegation didn't have the promised quote-unquote dirt. In fact, they got upset about that, did they not?
Generally, yes.
You say in volume 1, page 118, that Trump Jr. asked, what are we doing here? What do they have on Clinton? And during the meeting, Kirshner actually texted Manafort saying it was, quote, a waste of time, end quote. Is that correct?
I believe it's in the report along the lines you specify.
So to be clear, top Trump campaign officials learned that Russia wanted to help Donald Trump's campaign by giving him dirt on his opponent. Trump Jr. said loved it. Then he and senior officials held a meeting with the Russians to try to get that Russian help. But they were disappointed because the dirt wasn't as good as they had hoped. So to the next step, did anyone, to your knowledge, in the Trump campaign ever tell the FBI of this offer?
I don't believe so.
Did Donald Trump Jr. tell the FBI that they received an offer of help from the Russians?
I'm going to, that's about all I'll say on this aspect of it.
Wouldn't it be true, sir, that if they had reported it to the FBI or anyone in that campaign during the course of your 2-year investigation, you would have uncovered such a...
I would hope, yes.
Yes. Sir, is it not the responsibility of political campaigns to inform the FBI if they receive information from a foreign government?
I would think that that's something they would and should do.
Well, not only did the campaign not tell the FBI, they sought to hide the existence of the June 9th meeting for over a year. Is that not correct?
On the general characterization, I would question it. If you're referring to later initiative that flowed from the media, then...
No, what I'm suggesting is that you've said in volume 2, page 5, on several occasions the president directed aides not to publicly disclose the email setting up the June 9th meeting.
Yes, that's accurate.
Thanks. Sir, given this illegal assistance by Russians, you chose, even given that, you did not charge Donald Trump Jr. or any of the other senior officials with conspiracy, is that right?
Correct.
And while it
when
may
you're
not...
talking about, if you're talking about other individuals, you're talking about the attendees.
Yes, that's
on
right.
June 9, and that's
right.
accurate.
So, Mr. Mueller, even though you didn't charge them with conspiracy, don't you think that the American people would be concerned that these 3 senior campaign officials eagerly sought a foreign adversary's help to win elections? And don't you think that reporting that is important, that we don't set a precedent for future elections?
I can't accept that characterization.
Well, listen, I think that it seems like a betrayal of American values to me, sir, that someone with, if not being criminal, is definitely unethical and wrong. And I would think that we would not want to set a precedent that political campaigns should not divulge of information if it's foreign government's assistance. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Turner.
Mr. Mueller, I have your opening statement, and in the beginning of your opening statement, you indicate that pursuant to Justice Department regulations, that you submitted a confidential report to the Attorney General at the conclusion of the investigation. What I'd like you to confirm is the report that you did, that is the subject matter of this hearing, was to the Attorney General.
Yes.
Now, you also state in this opening statement that you threw overboard the word collusion because it's not a legal term. You would not conclude because collusion was not a legal term.
Well, it depends on how you want to use the word. In the general parlance, people can think of it that way, but if you're talking about in the criminal statute arena, you can't, because it really is much more aptly and accurately described as conspiracy.
Right, so in your words are, it's not a legal term, so you didn't put it in your conclusion, correct? That's what your opening statement says. Mr. Mueller, I want to talk about your powers and authorities. Now, the Attorney General and the appointment order gave you powers and authorities that reside in the Attorney General. Now, the Attorney General has no ability to give you powers and authority greater
Michael
than the
Turner,
powers
Republican
and authority of the
from
Attorney General.
Ohio's
correct?
10th District.
No, I don't believe, I think that out. It's correct.
Mr. Mueller, I want to focus on one word in your report. It's the second to the last word in the report. It's exonerate. The report states, accordingly, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it does not exonerate him. Now, in the judiciary hearing, in your prior testimony, you've already agreed with Mr. Radcliffe that exonerate is not a legal term, that there is not a legal test for this. So I have a question for you, Mr. Mueller. Mr. Mueller, does the Attorney General have the power or authority to exonerate? Now, what I'm putting up here is the United States Code. This is where the Attorney General gets his power, and the Constitution and the annotated cases of these, which we've searched. We even went to your law school, because I went to Case Western, but I thought maybe your law school teaches it differently. And we got the criminal law textbook from your law school. Mr. Mueller, nowhere in these, because we had them scanned, is there a process or description on exonerate. There's no office of exoneration at the Attorney General's office. There's no certificate at the bottom of his desk. Mr. Mueller, would you agree with me that the Attorney General does not have the power to exonerate?
I'm going to pass on that.
Why?
Because it embroils us in a legal discussion, and I'm not prepared to do a legal discussion in that arena.
Well, Mr. Mueller, you would not disagree with me when I say that there is no place that the Attorney General has the power to exonerate, and he's not been given that authority. You would not.
Again, I'm not going to. I take your question.
Great. Well, the one thing that I guess is that the Attorney General probably knows that he can't exonerate either. And that's the part that kind of confuses me. Because if the Attorney General doesn't have the power to exonerate, then you don't have the power to exonerate. And I believe he knows he doesn't have the power to exonerate. And so this is the part that I don't understand. If your report is to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General doesn't have the power to exonerate, and he does not, and he knows that you do not have that power, you don't have to tell him that you're not exonerating the president. He knows this already. So then that kind of changed the context for the report.
No, we included in the report for exactly that reason. He may not know it, and he should know it.
So you believe that the Attorney Bill Barr believes that somewhere in the hallways of the Department of Justice there's an office of exoneration?
No, that's not what I said.
Well, I believe he knows, and I don't believe you put that in there for Mr. Barr. I think you put that in there for exactly what I'm going to discuss next.
To be clear,
so the Washington Post yesterday, when speaking of your report, the
if
article
Mueller
said
hadn't said that he was not exonerated, that might have sent a signal that a future potential indicting authority, whether it was the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, whether it was the Department of Justice, would think that there had been a full investigation that had exonerated the president. That's why he had to speak to that sentence. Others would wish that Mueller would have been even clearer and said, there's indictable crimes here. The only reason we aren't going forward on them is because of the OLC opinion. But by saying he's not exonerated, that leaves open the question that future investigators could in fact make a determination to indict. That's what's at stake. That's why it's so important. Let's go back to this, guys.
You have no more power to declare him exonerated than you have the power to declare him Anderson Cooper. So the problem that I have here is that since there's no one in the criminal justice system that has that power, the president pardons, doesn't exonerate.
I want to take a knock on Case Western Law School. The guy was trying to be folksy and say, oh, your fancy law school might have this different rules, but my law school, let's be clear. The signal that was sent by Bob Mueller about exoneration was critically important if there's ever going to be any accountability or any indictment on these matters. This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff Smith. We're going to be right back after this break.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. Bob Mueller Testimony Edition, Part 2. This is in front of the Intelligence Committee. We're going to be back.
Tried to use his position with the Trump campaign to make more money. Let's focus on the betrayal and greed. Your investigation, sir, found a number of troubling contacts between Mr. Manafort
This is
and Russian
Representative
individuals
Andre
during
Carson,
and after the
Democrat from
campaign. Is
Indiana,
that right, sir?
7th District.
Correct. Correct.
In addition to the June 9th meeting just discussed, Manafort also met several times with a man named Konstantin Kilimnik, who the FBI assessed to have ties with Russian intel agencies. Is that right, sir?
Correct.
In fact, Mr. Manafort didn't just meet with him, he shared private Trump campaign polling information with this man linked to Russian intelligence. Is that right, sir?
That is correct.
And in turn, the information was shared with a Russian oligarch tied to Vladimir Putin. Is that right, sir?
Allegedly.
Director Mueller, meeting with him wasn't enough. Sharing internal polling information wasn't enough. Mr. Manafort went so far as to offer this Russian oligarch tied to Putin a private briefing on the campaign. Is that right, sir?
Yes, sir.
And finally, Mr. Manafort also discussed internal campaign strategy on 4 battleground states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota, with the Russian intelligence-linked individual. Did he not, sir?
That's reflected in the report, as were the items you listed previously.
Director Mueller, based on your decades of years of experience at the FBI, would you agree, sir, that it creates a national security risk when a presidential campaign chairman shares private polling information on the American people, private political strategy related to winning the votes of the American people, and private information about American battleground states with a foreign adversary?
Is that the question, sir?
Yes, sir.
I'm not going to speculate along those lines. To the extent that it's within the lines of the report, then I support it. Anything beyond that is not part of that which I would support.
Well, I think it does, sir. I think it shows an infuriating lack of patriotism from the very people seeking the highest office in the land. Director Mueller, Manafort didn't share this information in exchange for nothing, did he, sir?
I can't answer that question without knowing more about the question.
Well, it's clear that he hoped to be paid
Offered a
back
view
money he
about
was
whether
owed
or not, not
by
have a response, but whether or
Russian or
not they
Ukrainian
would support
oligarchs in
the
return
bringing
for
of
the
articles
passage
of
of
impeachment.
private campaign information, correct?
That is true.
Director Mueller, as my colleague Mr. Heck will discuss later, greed corrupts. Would you agree, sir, that the sharing of private campaign information in exchange for money represents a particular kind of corruption, one that presents a national security risk to our country, sir?
I'm not going to opine on that. I don't have the expertise in that arena to really opine.
Would you agree, sir, that Manafort's contacts with Russians close to Vladimir Putin and his efforts to exchange private information on Americans for money left him vulnerable to blackmail by the Russians?
I think generally so, that would be the case.
Would you agree, sir, that these acts demonstrated a betrayal of the democratic values of our country rests on?
I can't agree with that.
Director Mueller.
Not that it's not true, but I cannot agree with it.
Yes, sir. Director Mueller, well, I can tell you that in my years of experience as a law enforcement officer and as a member of Congress, fortunate to serve on the Intel Committee, I know enough to say yes. Trading political secrets for money with a foreign adversary can corrupt, and it can leave you open to blackmail, and it certainly represents a betrayal of the values underpinning our democracy. I want to thank you for your service again, Director.
We're going to be right
Mueller.
back. This is the Thom Hartmann Show.
I yield back.
We're listening to Bob Mueller's testimony before the House Judiciary Committee. We're going to be right back. We're going to be talking to Bob Ney for a minute to get his perspective, and then we'll go back to the testimony. Well, folks, history happening right now. Live. We're bringing it to you live here on the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jefferson Smith, honored to be with you. Former Republican member of Congress, Bob Ney, joining us now just for a few minutes to give his key takeaways, key impressions. Then we're going to get back very quickly to the live testimony, to the questioning that's happening before the House Judiciary Committee. Bob, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you, Jefferson. Quite fascinating. First of all, I did want to mention that the president is tweeting, so his statement a few days ago that he wasn't really interested is actually not the case, as we knew anyway. I think also that, Mueller right off the bat has disappointed the Republicans because he's not going to go down into the, issue of the Steele dossier and any implications of it. The Republicans have, and I kind of was, I guess, a little bit surprised at this in the beginning. Now I'm not, but anyway, they are taking a very extremely aggressive approach at Mueller in the sense of yelling or anger or whatever you want to classify it. And I really didn't anticipate they would in general go down that path, frankly.
Yeah, a little surprising given that so much of their posture, so much the president's posture has been to say, oh, it's full exoneration. We just had, I think it was Congressman Ratcliffe saying, oh, there's no power to give exoneration. There could be no exoneration, right? It was sort of a weird contradiction. And then the other contradiction being, well, if the report was good for the president, why are they spending so much time undermining the investigation?
Well, that's correct. And then, now the one thing that came, strikingly out, of course, there was the exchange with California Representative Ted Lieu, Democratic member, and Mueller said unequivocally that the reason he didn't not even consider indicting the president was because of the guidance from the Office of the Legal Counsel within the Justice Department as one of the reasons, he didn't do that. And then later, when the Schiff hearing started, then he made and this was kind of bizarre for me to try to understand, but Mueller corrected an earlier answer that I just read to Lieu. So he opened up his testimony before Congressman Schiff's committee by correcting the remark. But Jefferson here, as you know, how he corrected it. He said, now, before we go to the questions, I want to add one correction to my testimony this morning. I want to go back to one thing that was said this morning by Mr. Lieu. You didn't charge the president because of the OLC opinion we just talked about. That's not the correct way to say it. As we say it in the report, and as I said in the opening, we did not reach a determination as to whether the president committed a crime. So really, that wasn't much of a correction, really, from what he said to Representative Lieu anyway, which indicates, of course, when you listen to it, at least in my opinion, that he couldn't make a charge because he had to follow the OLC guideline, which I think is, pretty significant point that the Democratic side will bring forth. I wanted to mention one thing. I think the one thing out of these hearings, people haven't read the Mueller report. I thought it was fascinating, the conversation beginning early in the first hearing of Don McGahn and the president's counsel and calling him at home and telling him to do certain things. I thought that in itself was, extremely damaging to the president.
And I do want to find that clip. We'll see if we can play that clip. We did play the clip, and we'll play again of the exchange with Congressman Lieu. Another moment of the clarification from Chairman Nadler in part one. We're now in part two of the testimony. That was before the Judiciary Committee, now before the Intelligence Committee, when Nadler asked about Trump's being called to testify. I'll say a key point here. If one wanted to critique, as I would, one wanted to critique Mueller as Sarah Kendzior has for being an insufficient Nazi hunter. The determination that Mueller made, that he could not reach a determination, not only that he could not bring an indictment, but could not reach a determination, I think reasonable people could argue, and in fact, I think history will argue, that if accountability is not found for this president, one of the key reasons will be Mueller's decision not to reach a determination and interpreting the OLC opinion as something that would keep from reaching that determination. Correct. But anyway, any closing word? Otherwise, I want to get back to the testimony.
I think this report obviously is quite damaging, and in the hearings are very fascinating. I think people will make some general ideas and conclusions off of it.
Do you think the Republican Party you served with, do you think your colleagues when you served would have taken the same posture as the Devin Nunes, as the Mitch McConnell Republican Party, as the Donald Trump Republican Party is taking now, going after Robert Mueller?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this is a whole new era, a brand new place.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Bob.
Thank you.
Right now is Jackie Spire from California, the 14th District, asking questions right now. Bob Mueller, we'll go back to it, and then we'll take a break.
Russian intervention as a hoax. And I'd like to get your comment on that. On page 26 of your report, you talk about the Internet Research Agency and how tens of millions of U.S. persons became engaged with the posts that they made, that there were some 80,000 posts on Facebook, that Facebook itself admitted that 126 million people had probably seen the posts that were put up by the Internet Research Agency, that they had 3,800 Twitter accounts and had designed more than 175,000 tweets that probably reached 1.4 million people. The Internet Research Agency was spending about $1.25 million a month on all of this social media in the United States in what I would call an invasion in our country. Would you agree that it was not a hoax, that the Russians were engaged in trying to impact our election?
Absolutely. That was not a hoax. The indictments we returned against the Russians, 2 different ones, were substantial in their scope, using that scope word again. And I think we have underplayed to a certain extent that aspect of our investigation that has and would have long-term damage
Jackie
to the
Spear
United States.
from San Francisco,
move quickly to
one of the 87 or 88 Democrats who are in favor publicly of articles of impeachment. We'll be right back. This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith sitting in. Thanks for listening. History happening, you might hope.
Staff as tourists, I guess, to start looking at where they wanted to engage. And there are many that suggest, and I'm interested in your opinion, as to whether or not Russia is presently in the United States looking for ways to impact the 2020 election.
I can't speak to that. That would be in levels of classification.
All right. Let me ask you this. Oftentimes when we engage in these hearings, we forget the forest for the trees. You have a very large report here of over 400 pages. Most Americans have not read it. We have read it. Actually, the FBI director yesterday said he hadn't read it, which was a little discouraging. But on behalf of the American people, I want to give you a minute and 39 seconds to tell the American people what you would like them to glean from this report.
Well, we spent substantial time assuring the integrity of the report, understanding that it would be our living message to those who come after us. But it also is a signal, a flag to those of us who have some responsibility in this area to exercise those responsibilities swiftly and don't let this problem continue to linger as it has over so many years.
All right. You didn't take the whole amount of time, so I'm going to yield the rest of my time to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Director Mueller, I wanted to ask you about conspiracy. Generally, a conspiracy requires an offer of something illegal, the acceptance of that offer, and an overt act in furtherance of it. Is that correct?
Correct.
And Don Jr. was made aware that the Russians were offering dirt on his opponent, correct?
I don't know that for sure, but one would assume, given presence at the meeting.
And when you say that you would love to get that help, that would constitute an acceptance of the offer?
It's a wide open request.
And it would certainly be evidence of an acceptance if you say, when somebody offers you something illegal and you say, I would love it, that would be considered evidence of an acceptance.
I'm going to stay away from any addressing one particular or two particular situations.
Well, this particular situation, well, I'll have to continue in a bit. Now yield to Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Mueller, it's been a long day. Thank you for being here. I do have a series of important questions for you, but before I do that, I want to take a moment to reemphasize
something. This is not John Stewart, who has recently been in the halls of Congress.
I've heard many people state no person is above the law. And many times recently they add not even the president, which I think is blazingly obvious to most of us.
I'm having a little problem hearing you, sir.
Is this better?
That is better, thank you.
I want you to know I agree with this statement that no person is above the law. But there's another principle that we also have to defend, and that is the presumption of innocence. And I'm sure you agree with this principle, though I think the way that your office phrased some parts of your report, it does make me wonder. I have to be honest with you. For going on 3 years, innocent people have been accused of very serious crimes, including treason. Accusations made even here today. They have had their lives disrupted and in some cases destroyed by false accusations for which there is absolutely no basis other than some people desperately wish that it was so. But your report is very clear. No evidence of conspiracy, no evidence of coordination. And I believe we owe it to these people who have been falsely accused, including the president and his family, to make that very clear. Mr. Mueller, the credibility of your report is based on the integrity of how it is handled. And there's something that I think bothers me and other Americans. I'm holding here in my hand a binder of 25 examples of leaks that occurred from the special counsel's office from those who associated with your work, dating back to as early as a few weeks after your inception and the beginning of your work, and continuing up to just a few months ago. All of them have one thing in common. They were designed to weaken or to embarrass the president, every single one. Never was it leaked that you'd found no evidence of collusion. Never was it leaked that the Steele dossier was a complete fantasy, nor that it was funded by the Hillary Clinton campaign. I could go on and on.
It wasn't leaked. There was no evidence of collusion because there was no conclusion. There was no evidence of collusion. In fact, there was lots of evidence of interaction and coordination of what the president has called collusion. Merely no indictment.
I'm not going to talk about specifics. I will mention, but talk for a moment about persons who become involved in an investigation and the understanding that in a lengthy, thorough investigation, some persons will be under a cloud that should not be under a cloud. And one of the reasons for emphasizing, as I have, the speed of an election, or not election, the speed of an investigation, is that so those persons who are disrupted as a result of the...
I appreciate that, but I do have a series of questions.
With the result of that investigation.
Thank you, and you're right, it is a cloud, and it's an unfair cloud for dozens of people. But to my point, are you aware of anyone providing information to the media regarding the raid on Roger Stone's home, including CNN?
I'm not going to speak to that.
Okay. Mr. Mueller, you sent a letter dated March 27th to Attorney General Barr in which you claimed the Attorney General's memo to Congress did not fully capture the context of the report.
Chris Stewart, by the way, started his career by writing techno-thrillers.
Response was not authorized.
Fun fact.
Did you make any effort to determine
He's the Mormon
who leaked
author
this
of techno-thrillers. Chris Stewart, here he is.
No, and I'm not certain. This is the letter of March 27th?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm not certain when it was publicized. I do know it was publicized, but I do not believe we would be responsible for the leaks.
Well,
I do believe that we have done a good job in assuring that no leaks occur.
We have 25 examples here of where you did not do a good job. Not you, sir. I'm not accusing you at all, but where your office did not do a good job in protecting this information. One more example. Do you know anyone who anonymously made claims to the press that Attorney General Barr's March 24th letter to Congress had been misrepresented or misrepresented the basis of your report?
And what was the question?
Do you know who anonymously made claims to the press that Attorney General Barr's March 24th letter to Congress had misrepresented the findings of your report?
No.
Sir, given these examples as well as others, you must have realized that leaks were coming from someone associated with the special counsel's office. What I'd like to ask is,
I do not believe that.
Well, sir, this was your work. You're the only one, your office is the only one who had information regarding this. It had to
when he
come
tries to
from
make a
your
big deal about leaks, what he's criticizing is that somebody within an investigation
which leads me to
was
my
sharing information with the press.
Did you do anything
You're either attacking the investigation or you're attacking the media, more likely and more aptly, probably attacking both. And this is essentially the strategy.
We were successful over the 2 years that we were in operation.
Well, I wish you'd been more successful, sir. I think it was disruptive to the American people. My time has expired. I yield back.
Well, that's where we agree. I wish he would have been more successful, too.
Mr. Quigley.
But a different way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you for being here. This too shall pass. Earlier today and
Mike
throughout
Quigley,
the day,
Democrat from Illinois,
stated the policy that a seated president cannot be indicted, correct?
Right.
And upon questioning this morning, you were asked, could that could a president be indicted after their service, correct?
Yes,
And your answer was that they could.
they could.
Director, please speak into the microphone.
I'm sorry, thank you.
So
They could.
the follow-up question that should be concerning is, what if a president serves beyond the statute of limitations?
I don't know the answer to that one.
Would it not indicate that if the statute of limitations on federal crimes such as this are 5 years, that a president who serves a second term is therefore...
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Howdy, everybody. Questioning right now is Mike Quigley from Illinois, a Democrat, making the same point that a caller of ours made. We are blessed with smart callers. And he, by the way, is one of the 87 or 88 Democrats the New York Times has said has come out in favor of articles of impeachment. Here's Quigley.
We need to consider that, and that the other alternatives are perhaps all that we have. But I appreciate your response. Earlier in questioning, someone mentioned that it was a question involving whether anyone in the Trump political world publicized the emails, whether or not that was the case. I just want to refer to volume 1, page 60, where we learned that Trump Jr. publicly tweeted a link to the leak of stolen Podesta emails in October of 2016. You're familiar with that?
I am.
So that would at least be a republishing of this information, would it not?
I'm not certain I would agree. I'm not certain I would agree with that.
Director Pompeo assessed WikiLeaks in one point as a hostile intelligence service. Given your law enforcement experience and your knowledge of what WikiLeaks did here and what they do generally, would you assess that to be accurate or something similar? How would you assess what WikiLeaks does?
Absolutely. And they are currently under indictment. It's Julian Assange.
But would it be fair to describe them as, you would agree with Mr. Director Pompeo, that's what he was when he made that remark, that it's a hostile intelligence service, correct?
Yes.
If we could put up slide 6. This just came out, WikiLeaks.
Hostile.
I love WikiLeaks. Donald Trump, October 10th, 2016. This WikiLeaks stuff is unbelievable. It tells you the inner heart. You got to read it. Donald Trump, October 12th, 2016. This WikiLeaks is like a treasure trove. Donald Trump, October 31st, 2016. Boy, I love reading those WikiLeaks. Donald Trump, November 4th, 2016. Do any of those quotes disturb you, Mr. Director?
He won't comment.
I'm not certain I would say.
How do you react to them?
It's probably problematic is an understatement.
Oh, there you go.
In terms of what it displays, in terms of giving some, I don't know, hope or some boost to what is and should be illegal activity.
Volume 1, page 59. Donald Trump Jr. had direct electronic communications with WikiLeaks during the campaign period. On October 3rd, 2016, WikiLeaks sent another direct message to Trump Jr. asking you guys to help disseminate a link alleging candidate Clinton had advocated a drone to attack Julian Assange. Trump Jr. responded that, quote, he had already done so. Same question. This behavior, at the very least, disturbing, your reaction?
Disturbing and also subject to investigation.
Could it be described as aid and comfort to a hostile intelligence service, sir?
I wouldn't categorize it with any specificity.
That's where he won't answer. But he will say disturbing and problematic.
I yield the balance to the chairman,
and subject
please.
to investigation.
Not sure I can make good use of 27 seconds, but Director, I think you made it clear that you think it unethical, to put it politely, to tout a foreign service like WikiLeaks publishing stolen political documents in a presidential campaign?
Certainly calls for investigation.
Thank you, Director. We're going to go now to Mr. Crawford, and then after Mr. Crawford's 5 minutes, we'll take a 5 or 10 minute break.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Mueller, for being here. Days after your appointment, Peter Strzok texted about his concern that there's, quote, quote, no big there in the Trump campaign investigation. Did Strzok or anyone else who worked on the FBI's investigation tell you that around 10 months into the investigation, the FBI still had no case for collusion?
Who? Can you repeat that?
Peter Strzok.
Could you, I'm sorry, can you move the microphone up a little closer?
Sure. There's
Thank you.
a quote attributed to Peter Strzok. He texted about his concern that there is, quote, no big there in the Trump campaign investigation.
His Wikipedia
Did he
picture
or anyone else
where
who
he's
worked on the
clean-shaven,
FBI's
or
investigation
his
tell you
official
that around
congressional
10 months
photo
into
when he
the
is clean-shaven for his look
FBI still
now,
had no
where he
case
looks like he is a more on-top, clean-cut
Is the Inspector
version
General report
of a
correct
member
that the
of the
text
Duck
messages
Dynasty
from
family?
Peter Strzok and Lisa Page's phones from your office were not retained after they left the special counsel's office?
Well,
It's an impressive beard.
it depends on what you're talking about. The investigation into those Peter Strzok went on for a period of time, and I'm not certain what it encompasses. It may well have encompassed what you're adverting to.
Okay, let me move on just real quickly. Did you ask the department to authorize your office to investigate the origin of the Trump-Russia investigation?
Rick Crawford started out as a radio guy.
I'm not going to get into that. It goes to internal deliberations.
So the circumstances surrounding the origin of the investigation have yet to be fully vetted then.
We can't trust
certainly
radio
glad that
people,
Attorney General
except
Barr
for
and
Thom
U.S.
Hartmann.
Attorney Durham are looking into this matter. With that, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the ranking member, Nunes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Mueller, I want to make sure you're aware of who Fusion GPS is. Fusion GPS is
Here's
a
Devin
political
Nunes,
operations
our favorite
firm that was working directly for the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democrat National Committee.
It's Democratic, buddy.
They produced the dossier. So they paid Steele, who then went out and got the dossier. And I know you don't want to answer any dossier questions.
But I would still like to talk
So
about
I'm
it
not
for a
going
while,
there.
even though you're not going to
But
answer any questions.
Your report mentions Natalia Vesnitskaya.
I would really
65
like to talk about Fusion GPS
She
lots of
meets in the
times
Trump
to uncover
Towers,
no
this infamous
information,
Trump
but to
Tower
try to
meeting.
distract
It's
the
in your
American
report. You've
people
heard many of the
about an attack
Democrats
on our elections.
Refer to it today. The meeting was shorter than 20 minutes, I believe. Is that correct?
I think what we have in our report reflects it was about that length.
So, do you know, so Fusion GPS, the main actor at Fusion GPS, the president of the company, or the owner of the company, is a guy named Glenn Simpson who's working for Hillary Clinton. Glenn Simpson, do you know how many times Glenn Simpson met with Natalia Vesnitskaya?
Myself? No.
Would it surprise you that the Clinton campaign dirty ops arm met with Natalia Vesnitskaya more times than the Trump campaign did?
Well, this is an area that I'm not going to get into, as I indicated at the outset.
Did you ever interview Glenn Simpson?
I'm going to pass on that.
According to, I'm going to change topics here. According to notes from the State Department official Kathleen Kavalak, Christopher Steele told her that former Russian intelligence head
I'm not going to comment on Devin Nunes'
and
neck.
Putin
I'm not going to
advisor
confirm nor
Surkov
deny
were sources for the Steele
Devin Nunes' neck.
dossier.
And to the comments that I'm getting about
knowing that
that,
these
they're
are
out of bounds,
not getting
disrespectful
into
of a
whether
member
these sources were
of the U.S. Congress.
real or not real.
Whether or not Devin Nunes has a neck
Was there any
is not
concern
germane
that there could have been disinformation
to the question of whether Donald
that was
Trump
going from the
has committed
Kremlin
high crimes
into
or
the Clinton
misdemeanors against the United
campaign
States of America?
and then being
It's not
fed
on topic,
into
and
the
I don't know why
FBI.
you're bringing it up.
As I said before, this is an area that I cannot speak to.
Is that because it's not in the report, or you're just, or because of an ongoing
Internal
investigation?
deliberations, other proceedings, and the like.
Okay. When Andrew Weissman and Zaneb Ahmed joined your team, were you aware that Bruce Orr, Department of Justice top official, directly briefed the dossier allegations to them in the summer of 2016?
Again, I'm not going to speak to that issue.
Okay. Before you arrested George Papadopoulos in July of 2017, he was given $10,000 in cash in Israel. Do you know who gave him that cash?
Again, it's outside our ambit, and questions such as that should go to the FBI or the department.
But it involved your investigation.
persons involved in my
We'll be right back. We're going to break. Mueller Day. This is Hartman Show. I'm Jeff.
We will stand in recess.
Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. Comments about beards? Comments about necks? Come on now. We'll be back. Thank the committees for somehow timing their breaks pretty well with our schedule. That right now they're on recess. We are on Free Speech TV. For those of you who have been terrifically patient or very fortunate to call just in time right now, let's go to J.A. watching us on Free Speech TV from Portland, not Oregon, but Maine. J.A., you win the Most Patient Listener Award. How you doing?
Hey, Jeff, how's it going? And yeah, that was a long wait, but anyway, I love you, I love Tom, and I watch you pretty persistently, or try to as much as possible. But
we appreciate it.
Kind of, I guess what's going on today with this Mueller thing is I really just called to comment on how disappointed, which I guess isn't too much new with the, I mean, it actually was MSNBC, and I think her name's Nicole Wallace, which I like her show a lot, but she kind of was just getting down on Mueller on how he wasn't putting on a good enough show, basically, which, you know, just, I guess, stems back to, I guess my real grievance is the guy's a Marine, been through the Vietnam War, and who knows what else, to be honest. So, you know, it's like, what they did. I guess, what do they expect from him other than to stick to kind of honor? I honestly feel like he's still way more educated than who's sitting in the Oval Office. So, breaks down to I appreciate you guys letting me get on the air, and yeah, I got my grievance out. And
you think Mueller's doing a good job?
I think he's doing exactly what everybody should expect from him. Basically, yeah. I think they're just, you know, I heard him talk about it. Coming through pages of a 400-page report, which the guy, you know, honestly, it seems like he's just annoyed with people not kind of being more aware of what he already has told everybody, basically, yeah. And like, we're going to go through this again, kind of. So anyway, just as a, you know, I'm just disappointed that they're trying to turn it into more Trump drama than, you know, sticking to like pick out how he's the things that he is saying, like, yes to, like, this guy did this and was taught, you know, the people that have been committed to crimes that were tied in the inner circle, basically, of the campaign, basically, which I know you're well aware of, and, you know, that's where I get most of my information from is you guys. So, anyway, I appreciate it. And I mentioned that one guy who kind of thought you hung up on him that unfortunately got through on Free Speech TV, which it's kind of cable, so I wouldn't sweat it too much. But anyway.
Oh, no, I don't sweat it. I mean, you know, we try to hear from alternative viewpoints from time to time.
Because he was, you know, you were kind of, you still wanted to talk to him, and you thought you hung up on him, obviously. But anyway, appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Jay. Appreciate it. So let me say a piece about Mueller. And by the way, what's happening right now is they're in recess. They're not done. They're going to come back. They're in recess. When they get back, we will get back to live coverage here on the Thom Hartmann Show with Jefferson Smith, me sitting in. I'm wondering if I should talk about myself in the third person more. We can set that aside for another day. We don't even need your calls on the topic. But if you end up offering an opinion, we might hear it. Let me offer some thoughts on Mueller. So it is there. I am seeing some critique. In fact, we had a caller who said, "Oh, it looks like somebody with Alzheimer's. Looks like somebody who doesn't have all his faculties, hurting his reputation." I don't share that critique. I think it is true that he is not performing like a Hollywood actor, nor is he performing as someone who's trying to take down a president. This is a guy who is a Republican. He is an institutionalist. He is, in his other career, a corporate lawyer who represents some of the nation's wealthiest individuals and companies. Middle-class people can't afford him. Small businesses can't afford him. When he investigated the NFL, he let them off the hook, despite some pretty clear evidence that maybe they should be held accountable for something. That was in his private practice, and he's going back to his private practice. We'll talk about Mueller and what we're learning, but the key thing is the facts. We'll be back. We're back. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. They're in recess during the House Intelligence Committee testimony of and questioning of Bob Mueller in the wake of the Mueller report. And there's been some commentary about Mueller himself. And I've offered some of my thoughts about him, but I think one of the biggest mistakes in this fog of war, as we look on how history might turn on a trifle, let me offer one of those trifles. And that is it being called the Mueller investigation. That it was being called the Mueller report. So when Mueller was done with it, well, I guess the investigation is over and the report is over. And that the focus goes on him and how good a job he does and who he is. Because, well, the investigation is the Mueller investigation. It's not the Mueller investigation. It's a Trump investigation. It's a corruption investigation. It's an obstruction of justice investigation. It's a coordination with a foreign power investigation. It's an investigation on an attack on American elections. Watergate wasn't named after the people who were, it wasn't about Mr. Water and Mr. Gate. It was about what happened. It was an investigation about the crime. One of the biggest mistakes that's been made by the news media in general, and I don't exempt myself, is calling this from the beginning the Mueller investigation, the Mueller report, instead of putting the attention where the attention needed to be, on the matter of the investigation, on whether or not crimes were committed, whether or not there were more than just minor misdemeanors that were committed. Let's take Bob, Lakewood, New York. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks for taking my call, Jeff.
Thanks for calling.
Appreciate it. I like it when you're on the show. You're a good change up from Tom, and I'm glad. Hope Tom's enjoying his day.
I'm like the off-speed pitch.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I still have you?
You do.
Okay, so my question is, and maybe this has already been answered, is how does a memo in the DOJ supersede our Constitution?
All right, I'll take that. Is that the sum of your question? I want to make sure I don't cut you off.
Yeah, that's it, and I'll take it off the air. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bob. It doesn't supersede it. It attempts to, if not interpret it, at least to operate atop it. The rationale for not indicting a sitting president is, imagine a rogue U.S. attorney who said, I don't like this president. I'm going to indict him for something. So they have to spend all of their time responding to that indictment and not leading the country. So the policy view is that, well, let's wait. And what the Constitution says, and what Mueller's report does say, what Mueller has said in his public statements, however few they might be, that there is a remedy, that there is a process the Constitution does provide for. And in fact, they would argue that people who interpret the OLC opinion that way, or who agree with the OLC's interpretation of executive privilege and executive protection from indictment, they would argue, oh, this is the exception that proves the rule. The exception that proves the rule is usually used wrong. Usually people use it as like, oh, well, this thing isn't true, and but usually another thing is true, therefore that's the exception. No, the exception that proves the rule is this sort of thing. They say, well, because the Constitution offers a path for accountability, and it names the path for accountability as impeachment, the fact that it does not say that, well, there can just be a regular indictment of a president, the fact that is accepted from what the Constitution does say, therefore suggests that the Constitution doesn't provide for, that policy should not provide for other pathways of accountability. It says impeachment, it doesn't say something else. If it meant other stuff, it would say that other stuff. It says impeachment. Now, others would say, no, just the fact that it offers impeachment, you could use the exception proves the rule on a flip. He said, no, it doesn't say the president is above the law and the president should be able to avoid indictment. If it meant that, it would have said that. That's why there is this debate. That's why during both Watergate and during the Clinton investigation, there were differing opinions, differing written opinions on whether or not a sitting president could be subject to indictment. Because of that different ability to argue the fact that the Constitution is silent about whether or not a president can be indicted. What Mueller did was side with the Barr interpretation, the Department of Justice current interpretation, that the fact that the Constitution doesn't lay out indictment itself, It doesn't lay out that you're free of indictment. It doesn't say you're above the law. That's why I think that's a strong argument. But the fact that it doesn't lay out indictment, but does lay out a process for impeachment, suggests that impeachment is the way you hold a president, a sitting president, accountable. And Mueller has made that plain, that's the... Now, in a world where, in fact, in a world before political parties, which is what we had when the Constitution was ratified, in a world where political parties weren't the primary, or at least when the Constitution was being argued upon when we fought the revolution, before political parties, before lobbyists, before Citizens United, before unlimited secret money, before the distortion that's happening in American democracy, one could say, oh, well, that is accountability. It's a check and balance because it's a different branch of government, and therefore Congress can hold the president accountable. What we recognize is right now, the odds that this Republican Senate will hold any Republican president accountable, including a president who, I don't know, went to Manhattan in the middle of Times Square and shot somebody? Would they hold him accountable for that? Is something that I don't know that we can expect. And therefore, the tools of accountability that the framers thought would exist, right now, it's not clear that they exist, which I think lays a policy argument in favor of the caller that we got and the question from Quigley, which is, well, wait a minute, if the president is reelected and the statute of limitations on these crimes runs, and you have a Republican Senate, doesn't that mean that, in fact, a president could be above the law? One of the reasons that's so important is because there is a debate right now happening within the U.S. Congress. It's happening within the households and living rooms and switchboards, if they still use switchboards, and Twitter feeds of every Democratic member of the Congress. And that is whether or not to support articles of impeachment. That's not the same as impeachment happening. There's a Senate that exists. And in each of them are saying, well, should I do this? How would I justify it? And the reason they keep going on to, well, is any president above the law? That's not just for us. That's for members of Congress to understand if we have that iron triangle of protection for a president who is committing crimes, then maybe you have to use the only pathway there is, which would be impeachment. That's what's at stake. Right after the break, we're going to come back
listening to
the
the
testimony.
Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. We're going to be right back. They're coming back from recess in the Mueller testimony right now.
Our selection today for the Thom Hartmann Book Club is This Land, How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West by Christopher Ketchum. This is from Chapter 1. It's about halfway through the chapter. He's talking about Bernard DeVoto. DeVoto was the first major historian of the West who was also an environmentalist and an activist, the first chronicler of what Wallace Stenger called the West's curious desire to rape itself. DeVoto was a Westerner raised in Utah. He suffered in the provincialism and intolerance of Mormon country, went east to study, and then teach at Harvard, settled in Cambridge, but never forgot the beauty of his native ground. Loving the land and history, said a magazine profile, but loathing the society. His histories, novels, criticism, his essays in Harper's Magazine were for 20 years, where for 20 years he wrote the oldest column in American journalism, Easy Chair, pointed always west. His trilogy, published in the 1940s, The Year of Decision, Across the Wide Missouri, and The Course of Empire, garnered the Pulitzer, the Bancroft, and the National Book Award. Widely celebrated, DeVoto used his position to become his generation's most outspoken defender of the public lands. He called the West a plundered province, a resource colony for corporations and absentee landlords who practiced, quote, an economy of liquidation. He was broad in his assault on the liquidators. He went after the timbermen, the mining companies, the stockmen, the cattle barons, the oilmen and gasmen, the overgrazers, the deforesters, the denuders, the profiteers of gold rushes and grass rushes. He named the bankers and congressmen who abetted the plundering, the Western hogs, he called them. They've been busy for a century laying waste to the West. Long before the public domain was vested with any permanence legally in the hands of the American people, before there was a consideration of the land itself or any environmental ethic, the West had been torn up, beaten down, subjected to the greed and profligacy of the commodity users. Ironically, the users, in their race to liquidate, helped drive the creation of the public land system we know today, as they proved the need for federal stewardship to stop their abuses. massive timber frauds in the 19th century, the largest land frauds seen in the West, led directly to the establishment of the Forest Service in the 20th century, its purpose to stop deforestation. Out-of-control cattle numbers in the steppe, overgrazing that turned the fragile soil to dust, led directly to the federal grazing regulatory system that eventually became the BLM. When in 1946 the commodity users conspired to destroy the public lands system, the system in which devotos saw the only hope for Western conservation and preservation, he stood to oppose them. Quote, he was the first conservationist in nearly half a century, except for Franklin D. Roosevelt, to command a national audience, said Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a student of his at Harvard. No one did more in the post-war years to rouse public opinion against the spoilers than Devoto. Devoto and Schlesinger had seen firsthand what unregulated industry could wreak in the arid lands when they drove cross-country together in the spring of 1940 and entered western Kansas past the 100th meridian. These were the last years of the Dust Bowl before FDR's soil conservation programs and the return rains of the 40s could heal the land. Wrote Devoto, a cemetery was 10 inches deep in sand. Half the headstones had toppled into it and been partly covered. Sagging shacks that had been farmhouses had their windows blown out and dust was 2 or 4 or 6 feet deep against their western walls and a foot deep against the far wall. A repulsive dust as fine as sifted flour. Now, 6 years after that trip with Schlesinger, Devoto was confronted with the West's cattle barons, the liquidators of the grass, who were hell-bent on reducing the region to the same mess of dust. In 1946, the Joint Committee on Public Lands of the American National Livestock Association met in Salt Lake City to discuss the goal of undermining what few regulations had been placed on livestock operators under the newly formed Bureau of Land Management. The stock growers' ambition went further than mere deregulation. They hatched a plan with the help of friends in Congress to begin moving all federal land, the BLM and Forest Service domain, as well as the national parks, into the control of the states. The plan evolved through 1946, 47, 48, with legislation making its way on Capitol Hill. Devoto covered the story for Harper's. He cautioned that the stock growers were attempting, quote, one of the biggest land grabs in American history. The public lands are first to be transferred to the states on the wholly justified assumption that there should be a state government not wholly compliant to the desires of stock growers. It could be pressured into compliance, he wrote in Harper's. Nothing in history suggests the states are adequate to protect their own resources or even want to, or suggests that cattlemen and sheepmen are capable of regulating.
Testimony. You're back hearing Eric Swalwell asking the questions.
As a
Democrat
result
of California,
of lies,
recent presidential candidate.
deletion of text messages, obstruction, and witness tampering, is it fair to say that you were unable to fully assess the scope and scale of Russia's interference in the 2016 election and Trump's role in that interference?
I'm not certain I would adopt that characterization in total. There may be pieces of it that are accurate, but not in total.
But you did state in Volume 1, page 10, that while this report embodies factual and legal determinations, the office believes it to be accurate and complete to the greatest extent possible. Given these identified gaps, the office cannot rule out the possibility that the unavailable information would shed additional light. Is that correct?
That is correct. We don't know what we don't know.
Why is it so important that witnesses cooperate and tell the truth in an investigation like this?
Because the testimony of the witnesses goes to the heart of just about any criminal case you have.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I'd yield back. And thank you, Director Mueller.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mueller, as special counsel, did you review
Coming
documents?
back here, you're listening to testimony of Robert Mueller before the House Intelligence Committee. I'm Jeff. This is Thom Hartmann Show.
Was the Steele dossier one of those documents that was reviewed?
And I can't discuss that case.
Elise Stefanik.
I'm just asking a process
Republican.
question. Have you read the Steele dossier?
I probably didn't need to tell you that.
Again, I'm not going to respond.
Given that she's talking about the Steele dossier.
You were tasked as special counsel
I'm surprised
to
she hasn't said
investigate
Benghazi.
whether there was collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign associates to interfere with the 2016 election. And the FBI, we know, has relevant documents and information related to the opening of the CI investigation. Were you and your team permitted to access all of those documents?
And again, I can't get into that investigative, what we collected and what we're doing with investigation materials.
Let me ask it this way. Was there any limitation in your access to documents related to the counterintelligence
It's such a broad question. I have real trouble answering it.
Did the special counsel's office undertake any efforts to investigate and verify or disprove allegations contained in the Steele dossier?
Again, I can't respond.
The reason I'm asking for the American public that is watching, it's apparent that the Steele dossier formed part of the basis to justify the FBI's counterintelligence investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. As we know, it was used to obtain a FISA warrant on Carter Page. This is why I'm asking these questions. Did your office undertake any efforts to identify Steele's sources or subsources?
Again, the same answer.
Were these tasks referred to any other agencies?
Again, I can't speak to it.
Did your office consider whether the Russian government used Steele's sources to provide Steele with disinformation?
Again, I can't speak to that.
I understand I'm asking these questions just for the record, so thanks for your patience. Shifting gears here, did any member of the special counsel's office staff travel overseas as part of the investigation?
Yes, but I can't go further than that.
I'm going to ask, to which countries?
And I can't answer that.
Did they meet with foreign government officials?
Again, it's out of our bailiwick.
Did they meet with foreign private citizens?
Again, same response.
Did they seek information about a U.S. citizen or any U.S. citizens?
Again, a territory that I cannot go to.
Thank you for answering on the record. These are important questions for the American public, and we're hopeful that the IG is able to answer these questions. I will yield the balance of my time to the ranking member.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Mueller, I want to go back to, we started off with Joseph Mifsud, who's at the center of this investigation. He appears in your report a dozen times.
All ranking member means
or more.
Is the person who would be chair.
He really is the epicenter.
His party
He's
were
at
in
the
control.
origin of this. He's the man who supposedly knows about Clinton's emails. You've seen on the screen, the Democrats have continually put up all the prosecutions that you made against Trump campaign officials and others. But I'm struggling to understand why you didn't indict Joseph Mifsud, who seems to be the man in the middle of all of this.
Well, I think you understand that you cannot get into either classified or law enforcement information without a rationale for doing it. And I have said all I'm going to be able to say with regard to Mr. Mifsud.
Were you aware of Kathleen Kavalek's involvement, that she had met with Ms. Steele, the State Department official?
Again, I can't respond to that question. It's outside my jurisdiction.
Okay. The Carter Page FISA warrant was re-upped 3 times. The last time it was re-upped was under your watch. So were you in the approval process of that last time that the Carter Page warrant was?
Well, I can't speak specifically about that warrant, but if you ask, was I in the approval chain, the answer is no.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Mr. Castro. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Special Counsel Mueller, for your testimony and for your service to our country. Donald Trump over the years has surrounded himself with some very shady
Joaquin
people.
Castro, brother of the presidential
People that lied
candidate, twin
for
brother.
him, people that covered up for him, people that helped him enrich himself.
You're behind me in law school.
I want to talk specifically about one of those instances
better
that's in
grades
your
than you did.
report. Specifically, let's turn to the Trump Tower Moscow project, which you described in your report as, quote, as a, quote, highly lucrative deal for the Trump organization. Is that right?
I would have to look at the quote from the
Sure.
report if you have it.
Sure, it's on volume 2, page 135. It's described as highly lucrative.
Okay, I have it.
Sure.
I have it. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no problem. Your office prosecuted Michael Cohen, and Michael Cohen was Donald Trump's lawyer, for lying to this committee about several aspects of the Trump Organization's pursuit of the Trump Tower Moscow deal. Is that right?
That's correct.
According to your report, Cohen lied to, quote, minimize links between the project and Trump, unquote, and to, quote, stick to the party line, unquote, in order not to contradict Trump's public message that no connection existed between Trump and Russia. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, when you're talking about the party line here, the party line in this case...
If I could interject, the one thing I should have said at the outset, if it was in the report, and consequently, I do believe it to be true.
Thank you. The party line in this case was that the deal ended in January 2016. In other words, they were saying that the deal ended in January 2016 before the Republican primaries. In truth, though, the deal extended to June 2016, when Donald Trump was already the presumptive Republican nominee. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The party line was also that Cohen discussed the deal with Trump only 3 times, when in truth, they discussed it multiple times. Is that right?
Also true, and part of the basis for the plea that he entered for lying to this entity.
Thank you, and thank you for prosecuting that. The party line was also that Cohen and Trump never discussed traveling to Russia during the campaign, when in truth, they did discuss it. Is that right?
That's accurate.
And the party line was that Cohen never received a response from the Kremlin to his inquiries about the Trump Tower Moscow deal. In fact, Cohen not only received a response from the Kremlin to his email, but also had a lengthy conversation with a Kremlin representative who had a detailed understanding of the project. Is that right?
If it's in the report, that is accurate. Recitation of that piece of the report.
So you have the candidate Trump at the time saying he had no business dealings with Russia, his lawyer who was lying about it, and then the Kremlin who during that time was talking to President Trump's lawyer about the deal. Is that right?
I can't adopt your characterization.
Not only was Cohen lying on Trump's behalf, but so was the Kremlin. On August 30th, 2017, 2 days after Cohen submitted his false statement to this committee, claiming that he never received a response to his email to the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin's press secretary told reporters that the Kremlin left the email unanswered. That statement by Putin's press secretary was false, wasn't it?
I can't speak to that.
Although it was widely reported in the press.
Again, I can't speak to that, particularly if it was dependent upon media sources.
But it was consistent with the lie that Cohen had made to the committee. Is that right?
I'm not certain I could go that far.
So Cohen, President Trump, and the Kremlin were all telling the same lie.
I defer to you on that. I can't get into the details.
Special Counsel Mueller, I want to ask you something that's very important to the nation. Did your investigation evaluate whether President Trump could be vulnerable to blackmail by the Russians because the Kremlin knew that Trump and his associates lied about connections to Russia related to the Trump Tower deal?
I can't speak to that.
I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Mueller, you've been asked many times this afternoon about collusion, obstruction of justice, and impeachment and the Steele dossier, and I don't think your answers are going to change if I ask you about those questions. So I'm going to ask about a couple of press stories, because a lot of what the American people have received about this have been on press stories, and some of that has been wrong, and some of those press stories have been accurate. On April 13th, 2018, McClatchy reported that you had evidence Michael Cohen made a secret trip to Prague during the 2016 presidential election. I think he told one of the committees here in Congress that was incorrect. Is that story true?
I can't go into it.
Got you. On October 31st, 2016, Slate published a report suggesting that a server at Trump Tower was secretly communicating with Russia's Alpha Bank, and I quote, akin to what criminal syndicates do. Do you know if that story is true?
Do not.
Do not.
You do not?
Know whether it's true.
So
we'll be right back. We've got just a little bit of time left on the show. The Mueller testimony will continue. At the very end, I'll offer some thoughts, some of the quick takeaways. We'll also be talking about it tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening to the Mueller testimony with us and some of my commentary, hopefully some of it relevant, hopefully some of it at least mildly amusing. We'll be right back after this. This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith, and thanks to you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. We'll be right back after this.
It's victim notification process when a person, entity, or campaign has fallen victim to active measures of attack. Would you agree with this?
It sounds like a worthwhile endeavor. I will tell you, though, that the ability of our intelligence agencies to work together in this arena is perhaps more important than that. And adopting whatever, and I'm not that familiar with legislation, but whatever legislation will encourage us working together. By us, I mean the FBI, CIA, NSA, and the rest. It should be pursued aggressively, early.
Who do you think should be responsible within the federal government to counter disinformation?
I'm no longer in the federal government, so
But you've had a long career, storied career, and I don't think there's anybody who better understands the threat that we are facing than you. Do you have an opinion as a former FBI officer?
As to
who should be the coordinating points within the federal government on how to deal with disinformation?
I don't want to wade in those waters.
A good copy. One of the most striking things in your report is that the Internet Research Agency not only undertook a social media campaign in the U.S., but they were able to organize political rallies after the election. Our committee issued a report and insight on saying that Russian active measures are growing with frequency and intensity, and including their expanded use of groups such as the IRA, and these groups pose a significant threat to the United States and our allies in upcoming elections. Would you agree with that?
Yes. In fact, one of the other areas that we have to look at are many more companies, or not companies, many more countries are developing capability to replicate what the Russians had done.
You alluded to making sure all the elements of the federal government should be working together. Do you have a suggestion on a strategy to do that to counter this disinformation?
Not overarching.
Is this, in your investigation, did you think that this was a single attempt by the Russians to get involved in our election, or did you find evidence to suggest they'll try to do this again?
No, it wasn't a single attempt. They're doing it as we sit here. And they expect to do it during the next campaign.
Director Mueller, I appreciate your time and indulging us here in multiple committees, and I yield back to the ranking member if he has. I yield back to the chairman.
Mr. Heck. Director Mueller, I'd like to go to the motives behind the Trump campaign, encouragement and acceptance of help during the election. Obviously, a clear motivation was to help them in what would turn out to be a very close election, but there was another key motivation, and that was, frankly, the desire to make money. I always try to remember what my dad, who never had the opportunity to go beyond the 8th grade,
Democrat from Washington,
taught me, which is that I should never, ever underestimate the capacity of some people to cut corners and even more in order to worship and chase the almighty buck. And this is important because I think it, in fact, does go to the heart of why the Trump campaign was so unrelentingly intent on developing relationships with the Kremlin. So let's quickly revisit one financial scheme we just discussed, which was
connecting the investigation, connecting Trump conduct not only to political power, but also to cash. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jefferson Smith. We'll be back for our big finish in just a moment. Howdy, everybody. We're going to take just a few more seconds of the hearing, then we'll wrap up. The hearing will go on. Our show must end in just a moment, but we want to have for just a few of the takeaways. Let's hear Denny Heck from Washington just for a moment before we do that. You're listening to The Hartmann Show.
Campaign aids, that the campaign was an infomercial for the Trump organization and his properties?
I'm not familiar with that.
Then let's turn to Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort. Did, in fact, your investigation find any evidence that Manafort intended to use his position as Trump's campaign chair for his own personal financial benefit?
I would say there was some indication of that, but I won't go further.
I think you'll find it on page 135 of Volume 1. During the transition, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, met with Sergei Gorkov, the head of a Russian-owned bank that is under U.S. sanctions. And according to the head of the bank, he met with Kushner in his capacity as CEO of Kushner Companies to discuss business opportunities. Is that correct, sir?
I'm not certain.
I'm not
certain about that. Let me just put it that way.
It was asserted thusly in your report, Volume 1, 160, pages 161 and 162. Your report notes that at the time, Kushner Companies were trying to renegotiate a billion, with a B, $1 billion lease of their flagship building at 666 Fifth Avenue, correct?
I'm not familiar with those financial arrangements.
Also on page 162, where Kushner Companies, it was asserted, had debt obligations coming due on the company. Eric Prince, a supporter close to Trump.
Let's jump in. We're right at the end. I want to play two clips that I think are two of the most important things to take away from this hearing. One, which is, I'm not going to say a new statement, but more than just clarification. And then the other is a really important reminder. Can we play the first one, which is Trump being asked, or excuse me, which is Mueller being asked about the DOJ policy?
Was there sufficient evidence to convict President Trump or anyone else with obstruction of justice?
We did not make that calculation.
How could you not have made the calculation with the regulations?
The OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel, indicates that we cannot indict a sitting president. So one of the tools that a prosecutor would use is not there.
Could you charge the president with a crime after he left office?
Yes.
You believe that you could charge the President of the United States with obstruction of justice after he left office?
Yes, but the OLC opinion says that the prosecutor, while he cannot bring a charge against the sitting president, nonetheless he can continue the investigation to see if there are any other persons who might be drawn into the conspiracy.
So to be clear, what he said was the OLC opinion is the reason why could not reach a conclusion, could not offer an indictment, not bring an indictment against the president. Let's play the second clip. This is about, we got this question. Deborah, I'm not going to have time to get to it because we're wrapping the show, but Deborah, who's a Trump supporter, who says, well, she's in favor of Trump, why is he getting so dogged? A question that I have, and it would have been my response to you live, and apologies, Deborah, that we won't be able to take time for your call, but I still understand your question, and I'll attempt to answer it. And I'll answer sort of the question with a couple questions, which is why didn't Trump testify? Let's at least get this clip, and then I'll respond to it.
Did any senior White House official refuse a request to be interviewed by you and your team?
The key question comes 26 seconds in.
Let me take that back. I would have to look at it, but I'm not certain that that was the case.
Did the president refuse a request to be interviewed by you and your team?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And is it true that you tried for more than a year to secure an interview with the president?
Yes.
Yes, tried more.
And is it true that you and your team advised the president's lawyer that, quote, an interview with the president is vital to our investigation, close quote?
Interview was vital.
And is it true that you also, quote, stated that it is in the interest of the presidency and the public for an interview to take place, close quote?
Yes.
It's in the public interest to have that
interview. But the president
interview.
still refused to sit for an interview by you or your team?
True.
But the president refused.
True.
And did you also ask him to provide written answers to questions on the 10 possible episodes of obstruction of justice crimes involving him?
Yes.
So my response is why the president didn't sit down for an interview. And if you think that that's sort of the normal thing, remember Bill Clinton did sit for a deposition in the Paula Jones case, that Hillary Clinton did sit for the better part of a day for the Benghazi hearing, whether or not you think that was a kangaroo court or not. Trump would not sit for an interview. Trump would not respond to questions. And if your thought is, oh, well, it was so to avoid perjury, my follow-up question is, well, why would we think he would lie? Why would his lawyers think that he would lie? Why would, if we think that there was nothing bad that happened, wouldn't he sit for that interview? But I do believe in a presumption of innocence. But here's what I will offer. And I will acknowledge that I wish that Mueller had written his report differently. I wish he had flipped it a little bit. I wish he would have offered some different sentences using the same facts that are now publicly available in the Mueller report. Wish he would have started with obstruction of justice, to say there was evidence that could be predicates for a crime of obstruction of justice. We are not pursuing that indictment because the Department of Justice policy bars us from bringing such an indictment. If people want to bring such a thing, they have to do it after he leaves office, or they have to use the route of impeachment. Second part, because perhaps some of those pieces, some of that lying behavior, some of that withholding of information, including the president not sitting for an interview, we were unable to get all the evidence to reach a conclusion on whether or not there was coordination between the highest levels of the Trump campaign and Russian entities trying to investigate, trying to interfere with American elections. It didn't go down that way. But if you use the same facts and just flip it in its order, you can reach, roughly speaking, those conclusions. And it's hard for me not to reach those conclusions. Tomorrow we'll talk more about that. Talk more about what we've learned from these hearings. We thank everybody for listening to those hearings, for engaging in democracy rather than just distraction, engaging in this hearing rather than just whatever top 40 hits are on some adjacent radio station. We appreciate you very much.
Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We'll be right back tomorrow. This is Tom's Show. I'm Jeff. Thank you so much.
From UN headquarters in New York, I'm Luke Vargas with your World in
We say fight back!
favor?